say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Cokeland, The Secret History of Coke Industries and Corporate Power in America by Christopher Leonard. This is from the preface. On May 18th, 1981, 4 Wall Street bankers traveled to Wichita, Kansas. They went there to make an offer to Charles Koch, the CEO of an obscure mid-size energy company. The bankers from Morgan Stanley wanted to convince Koch to take his family's company public, offering shares for sale on the New York Stock Exchange. Their deal was squarely in line with the conventional wisdom of corporate America at the time. Going public was seen as a natural progression for companies like Koch Industries, offering them access to big pools of money and promising enormous paydays for the existing team of executives. All it required from the CEO was to surrender control. Morgan Stanley, in return, would collect a small fortune in fees. Charles Koch was 45 years old. He had run Koch Industries since he was 32 when his father died suddenly. He was trim, tall, and had an athlete's build. He spoke quietly in meetings and seemed almost passive. The bankers laid out their plan to take Koch public. They revealed what, to most executives at least, might have been the most significant detail. If Charles Koch agreed to the deal, he could earn $20 million overnight. The bankers seemed incredulous when they prepared a confidential memo about Koch's reaction. "He does not want this cash," the memo reported. Charles Koch calmly explained to them why their offer made no sense. His company was breathtakingly profitable. It operated in vital, deeply complex corners of the American energy industry. During the 1980s, Koch Industries was the largest purchaser and transporter of U.S. crude oil. It owned an oil refinery. It employed teams of commodity traders who bought and sold a wildly diverse menu of raw materials and financial products, from gasoline to paper futures contracts. This might have encouraged most CEOs to take their company public. Koch Industries, however, did not want outsiders to know how much money its traders were earning. Taking the company public would expose too many of its secrets. The memo said, certain of Koch's commodity traders are particularly worried that their high salaries, once disclosed to the public, would be used against them by their trading partners. Secrecy was a strategic necessity for Koch Industries. Charles Koch did not want to surrender it. He also didn't want to surrender control. He had a specific, clear vision of how to run his company, and he didn't need Wall Street investors to interfere. If the bankers expected Charles Koch to go along with the conventional wisdom of their time, then they, like so many outsiders, did not understand him. Beneath his low-key veneer, Charles Koch was, at his core, a fighter. He had unmovable ideas about how things should be, and he did not back down when challenged. When he was challenged by his own brothers for control of Koch Industries, he fought them in a bitter legal battle that lasted decades. When he was challenged by members of a powerful labor union during his first years as CEO, he fought them even as they committed an act of industrial sabotage that nearly destroyed Koch's oil refinery. When the FBI and the U.S. Department of Justice launched a criminal investigation into Koch Industries' oil gathering business, Charles Koch fought them with every legal and political tool at his disposal. When a liberal Congress and President Barack Obama sought to impose regulations on the fossil fuel industry to control greenhouse gas emissions, Charles Koch fought them in ways that changed U.S. politics. In each of these fights, Charles Koch prevailed. When Charles Koch dismissed the bankers in 1981, it was just a small skirmish in the larger war to control Koch Industries. After prevailing in that fight, he created a company that was true to his vision. He avoided the snares that entangled many publicly traded companies that report their financial results to investors every 3 months. Koch Industries didn't have to think quarter to quarter. The company thinks year to year. An internal think tank and deal-making committee called the Development Group will sometimes think through a business deal on a timeline measured in decades. This long-term view made Koch more nimble where other companies stumbled. In 2003, for example, Koch Industries bought a group of money-losing fertilizer plants when no publicly traded company was willing to take the risk. Today, those plants are as profitable as a broken ATM machine that spews out cash around the clock. Unlike publicly traded companies, Koch Industries does not pay out rich dividends to investors. Charles Koch insists on reinvesting at least 90% of the company's profits, fueling its constant expansion. This strategy laid the foundation for decades of continuous growth. Koch Industries expanded continuously by purchasing other companies and branching out into new industries. It specialized in the kind of businesses that are indispensable to modern civilization, but which most consumers never directly encounter. The company is embedded in the hidden infrastructure of everyday life. Millions of people use Koch's products without ever seeing Koch's name attached. Koch refines and distributes fossil fuels, from gasoline to jet fuel, on which the global economy is dependent. Koch is the world's third largest producer of nitrogen fertilizer, which is the cornerstone of our modern food system. Koch makes the synthetic materials used in baby diapers, waistbands, and carpets. It makes the chemicals used for plastic bottles and pipes. It owns Georgia Pacific, which makes the wall panels, beams, and plywood required to build homes and office buildings. It makes napkins, paper towels, stationery, newspaper, and personal hygiene products. Koch Industries owns a network of commodities trading offices in Houston, Moscow, Geneva, and elsewhere, which are the circulatory system of modern finance. The book, Kochland, by Christopher Leonard.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you. It's a beautiful Thursday here in Oregon. Hope your day is well. On the line with us right now, by the way, we're throughout the day. In our second hour, Professor Richard Wolff is going to drop by. We're going to be talking about why is the market relatively high when everything else is crashing, and what does this say about the Fed? And in our third hour, Dr. J. Famiglietti will be with us. He's a professor at the School of Environment and Sustainability, talking about flooding, and it's like biblical plagues. But right now, Richard Clarke, is on the line with us. He's a national security and crisis management expert, former chief counterterrorism advisor to the National Security Council in the Clinton administration. The person that President Clinton tasked with building our stockpile. He's also the author of 9 books, including his latest, The Fifth Domain. His website, Richard Clarke, with an E at the end, .net. And Richard Clarke is his Twitter handle. Mr. Clarke, welcome back to the program. It's been a while since we talked. So glad to have you with us. In your book, Warnings, you talked about the need to constantly scan the horizon looking for threats. How have the Clinton and Obama administrations behaved relative to looking at threats compared to the Bush and Trump administrations?
Well, Tom, it's good to be with you again. The book Warnings was about exactly this. It's got 12 case studies of places occasions where experts said there was something terrible coming, and they were data-driven. They had evidence. And they went to higher-ups, they went to government officials, and they were ignored. And one of the chapters in the book is about pandemic disease. And we demonstrate there that there was a lot of evidence. This is a book we wrote 4 years ago. There's a lot of evidence that there was going to be a major pandemic global disease, and that the government wasn't ready for it, and that people have been warning about it for years. The Clinton administration, as you point out, was afraid that this might happen and developed the first ever national medical emergency stockpile, which the Obama administration then used to crush Ebola in Africa before it could spread here. Unfortunately, the Obama administration, when they tried to refill the national stockpile of medical equipment, the Republicans in the Congress blocked them. So when Trump turned to it this time, it wasn't robust. But Tom, the point is, the Trump administration and the president himself were told about this coming in January, and that's when they could have acted to refill the national medical stockpile, and to do other things to get the testing kits ready and whatnot. And the evidence suggests they were warned in January and in February and did nothing.
Yeah, well, let me take it back from that. This from ABC News, and I'll just quote a couple of sentences from this report. I'd like to get your take on it, since you worked in these, inside the White House. As far back as late November, this is the first sentence, as far back as late November, U.S. intelligence officials were warning that a contagion was sweeping through China's Wuhan region, changing the patterns of life and business and posing a threat to the population, according to 4 sources briefed on the secret reporting. Concerns about what is now known as the novel coronavirus were detailed in a November intelligence report by the military's National Center for Medical Intelligence. The report was the result of analysis of wire and computer intercepts coupled with satellite images. It raised alarms that this could pose a serious threat to U.S. forces in Asia. And then they quote one of the sources who helped write the report. This is somebody from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Quote, analysts concluded that it could be a cataclysmic event. It was then briefed multiple times to the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon's Joint Staff, and the White House. And then they go on, from that warning in November, the sources described repeated briefings throughout December for policy makers inside the National Security Council and at the White House. This is pretty dramatic stuff.
Yeah, and what it means is you could have gotten on this last year, at the end of last year, but certainly by January. And what's the lesson from all of these facts? The lesson is that you have to have professionals in professional positions in the government. You can't have amateur hour with the National Security Council staff. You can't have amateur hour in the White House. You can't just pick up your friends. We do. You can't just pick up your friends and relatives and give them jobs and expect the system to work. He calls the professional cadre the deep state, which is pejorative. But there is a professional cadre in the government. And if you take away their jobs and give them, frankly, to boobs, then something will happen. And in this case, it's the pandemic. Something will happen where a trained professional will see intelligence information and know, break glass, sound alarm, and others will not. And this, unfortunately, is a very high price that we're paying for the president's attitude toward government and his inability to govern. We like the fact that some people like the fact that he had no government experience. Well, this is the price we're paying for having a president with no government experience.
Right. Literally the first president in the history of the United States who was neither in the military nor served any elected in any elected capacity. I'm curious, just a couple of other questions, and let me toss them out to you. And we've got about, I think, 3 minutes here until we hit a hard break. What are the other threats that Trump's ignoring? And are you concerned that, as he asserted back in 2012, he tweeted multiple times that Obama was going to start a war with Iran in order to get himself reelected? Do you think that that Trump might try to start a so-called small war, like Bush did with Iraq, to get reelected with Iran or North Korea, number one? And number two, overnight, Trump has been rage tweeting, over 40 tweets, many of them focusing on Mike Flynn. What would be the implications of a pardon for Mike Flynn? We have 2 minutes, sir.
Well, let me talk about Iran and North Korea. A war could break out at any time with Iran or North Korea, even though the professionals, again, the military, don't want that. The national security apparatus doesn't want that. We're trying to avoid those two wars, but they're both on hair triggers. And the president the other day instructed the military not to be pushed around anymore by Iranian naval ships in the Gulf. Well, they haven't been. But he told them to lean forward and be more aggressive when they come into contact with the Iranian Navy. That's the way a war starts, by accident. And I wouldn't put it past this man. I wouldn't put anything past this man. I certainly wouldn't put it past him to start a war, to change the topic, to take attention away from this incredible failure that he has had with the response to the pandemic. It's a long way between now and November, and anything is possible. I certainly hope that cooler heads will prevail, but you can't know when the president is the commander-in-chief, and there aren't a lot of filters between him and ordering us into war. With regard to Mike Flynn, he was always a bad choice. People in the Obama administration warned Trump not to pick him, that he was possibly already doing things with the Russians and the Turks that were illegal. This conversation with the FBI that Trump is focusing on was a conversation after he had done all the things that triggered the FBI's interest. It's not that conversation that got him in trouble. It's the things that caused that conversation that got him in trouble.
Remarkable stuff. Richard Clarke, his new book is The Fifth Domain. The author of 9 books, and all of them brilliant. Richard Clarke with an E.net is his website. You can tweet him at Richard Clarke. Richard, thank you so much for dropping by. It's great talking with you.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, and best of luck in keeping the nation alerted. You're so good at it. We'll be right back. It's 15 minutes past the hour. What's on your mind?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Back with more of the news of the day and your calls. Do you think that Trump is going to get away with this? Do you think he might start a war? And welcome back. Australia, I got to tell you about this. And Australia unveiled a dramatic initiative, this from the Huffington Post, to trace new cases of the coronavirus within its borders this week. An app the government officials hope 40% of the population will soon download. Users are asked to provide a name or a pseudonym. This is fascinating how this works. You download the app. Prime Minister Scott Morrison, in fact, promoting this fairly heavily. You download the app. You provide a name or a pseudonym, an age range, an area code, and a phone number. And every time the phone comes within 5 feet of another device with the app, the two share a digital handshake. They recognize each other by presumably Bluetooth. And it's an encrypted handshake. It's all, the data is anonymized essentially. But if anyone who you have been within 5 feet of, even if you don't know them, even if it's like, walking by them in a retail store, anybody you've been within 5 feet of in the recent past tests positive, then you are pinged to tell you that you have been exposed to the virus so that you can get tested. Because in Australia, you can just, walk into any clinic and get yourself a coronavirus test. They're ubiquitous. They're all over the country, and it's easy to do. And they're trying to get half the population to download this test, which seems like a great idea. Prime Minister Scott Morrison, there are concerns about privacy, right? But he says, I know this would be something that we might not do in a normal time, but this is not a normal time. They rolled this thing out 3 days ago. The Greg Hunt, member of Parliament in Australia, just tweeted, "We've ticked past 3 million registrations of the COVID Safe app. 3 million in 3 days is a great result, and there's work to be done to protect our doctors and nurses and get us back to the life we love." And then they, ask people to sign up for this. Singapore has a similar app that people are being asked to download. They're not getting as much compliance in Singapore. And, perhaps because Singapore's government is a little more fascistic than Australia's. And so, people in Singapore might be concerned, shall we say, about this, about giving all their information to the government. But the government of Singapore is already tracing people and spying on people. I mean, they've been doing it for a long time. But in Australia, this is amazing. In Australia, 6,753 people. Keep in mind, we have 1 million infections in the United States. And we have, theoretically, 60,000 dead when it's starting to look like those numbers are dramatically undercounted, and it's actually in the neighborhood of 100,000, which would be roughly more people than have died in every war we have had since the end of World War II. And so compare that with Australia, the entire country, not Sydney or Melbourne or Perth or Cairns, but the entire country, all of Australia, 6,700 cases. 91 people have died. No crisis for their hospitals, no public health crisis. They've got this thing under control. It's absolutely amazing. We'll be back. Stick around. It's 20 minutes past the hour. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. We have a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for people who are regular supporters of our program, and the essence of it is, I use a couple of examples. There's hundreds of them out there. In one case, Alabama is preparing to execute a man who was not guilty of the crime that he committed with a relatively high level of certainty, but still they're gonna kill this guy, an African American. And the other story out of New York State, where the police officers hogtied this guy, elbows behind him, tied his legs together, and then threw him down a flight of stairs, mangled his face. He looked he was totally beaten. 12 hours later, he commits suicide in his cell. How is it possible that our prisons do this kind of stuff? Because the 13th Amendment says that slavery is still legal in the United States. You have no rights if you've been convicted of a crime. We need to amend the Constitution. Check it out at thomhartmann.com. And welcome back. My rant today, which, by the way, we posted over at buzzflash.com. And in fact, Mark Carlin, buzzflash.com, has an amazing op-ed about herd immunity. I've been ranting for weeks now that, in my opinion, the Trump administration was listening to Matt Whitlock, the British health minister, back in the day when he was saying, we're going to pursue a herd immunity strategy. We'll just let the virus burn through the British population. And, it'll kill some old people and some weak people, but after that, we'll all be immune and everything will be wonderful. Well, that kind of went up in smoke when Boris Johnson got it and nearly died. But I think that Trump is continuing to do this, and you can see that. But perhaps a larger story, or not a larger story, but peripheral to this. All his life, Donald Trump has been able to escape responsibility by blaming others. Whenever his dozens of businesses failed, maybe hundreds, I don't know, from his airline company to his vodka company to a steak company, he had a board game, he had cufflinks, he had all kinds of products. And every time these companies failed, he blamed management. He always had a business partner in these companies, and he always blamed them. When his casinos failed, he took a $44 million paycheck. He had, the year before, taken them public. He had sold stock. His investors lost over $1 billion, but he took $44 million, put it in his own pocket, and then declared bankruptcy. And who did he blame then? This was back in the 90s, the late 90s. He blamed the economy and President Clinton. Now, in a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility for killing what may be 100,000 Americans right now, the New York Times today reporting that we're dramatically undercounting these deaths. We've got 60,000 official deaths. We may be undercounting them by as much as 60 or probably more like 50%, which means that we're over 100,000 now. We'll certainly be at 100,000 by Election Day. He's trying to avoid responsibility for killing literally more Americans that have died in all our wars since the end of World War II. The Korean War, 30,000 dead. The Vietnam War, 56 or 58,000 dead. Our smaller wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, another 10, 15,000 dead. You add all that up, it's 100,000 people, right? And that's how many Trump is going to have killed, more than every war since the end of World War II. And, through his incompetence. And who is he trying to blame for this? The Chinese. Now, keep in mind, Australia just yesterday reported their 91st death. The entire country, 91 people dead. The entire friggin' country. You know, the deaths in South Korea flattened out at around 300. Deaths in Taiwan, around 200. Deaths in New Zealand, they're 0 now. You've got countries literally all over the world who have this thing under control or are close to having it under control, and we have 4.5% of the world's population, and we've got a third of the world's cases and a quarter of the world's deaths. And Trump is now trying to blame China for this. He sent Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to the CIA to lead an effort through America's spy agencies to find evidence that this coronavirus started in a lab or jumped out of a lab in Wuhan, China. Now, the world scientists tell us that the genome of the virus, which is kind of like a roadmap to where it's been, show that it probably escaped from a wet market, from a bat in a wet market. But Americans right now really don't care where it started, no matter how hard Trump is going to try and point to that. This deadly virus is here, now, among us. And Americans want our government to provide widespread infection testing and antibody testing so we can know who has it and who had it. And in that, Trump and Kushner continue to fail. So my question for you, Trump was able to walk away from blame for all of his many business failures and his 6 bankruptcies. And now he's bankrupting America and killing Americans through his incompetence and trying to blame that incompetence on China. Now, it looks to me like this time it's not going to work, but Trump is betting the farm that it will. His 40 rage tweets overnight, he's working himself up to pardon Mike Flynn. Hey, let's have a distraction. He's doing everything he can to change the subject. If you look at his rage tweets from last night, his 40-plus rage tweets from last night, not one referencing the fact that there are 60,000 dead Americans, 60,000 families mourning and grieving, 1 million infections, hundreds of thousands of families frightened and scared to death because members of their families right now are fighting this virus either at home or in the hospital. Millions more Americans scared to death that if they just go to the supermarket, they're going to die. Did Trump address any of that last night in all of his rage tweets? No. No, it's all about grievance. It's all about, do-nothing Democrats who are actually trying to do something. This is literally the do-nothing Trump administration. Relative to the coronavirus and the economic fallout, what he's doing is as bad as or worse than what Herbert Hoover did in 1930 after the stock market crash in the fall of 1929. Herbert Hoover did literally nothing for 2 years. Is Trump going to get away with this?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And do you think he might start a war to distract us from it? It's what he said Obama was going to do in 2012. We'll be back with your call.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is by Joy Ann Reid. It's titled The Man Who Sold America. This is from the introduction titled Welcome to Gotham. To truly understand Donald Trump, you need to have lived in New York City in the 1980s and 90s when his businesses and marital escapades were a tabloid staple. Or maybe you just need to have grown up on Batman. Gotham City, which the brooding billionaire Bruce Wayne polices as his vigilante alter ego, is an exaggerated dystopian send-up of old New York. It's filled with over-the-top villains who, like Batman, possess no actual superpowers, but get by on their cleverness, their ostentatious wealth, and their ability to wreak havoc on the urban landscape. Donald Trump seems ripped right out of that comic book supervillain universe. With his cantilever hairstyle, weirdly long signature neckties, bizarre syntax, and penchant for slapping his surname on anything he's connected with, from buildings and golf courses to bottled water board games, and for a time, a sham university that promised anyone could learn to be just like the Donald. Trump and the cast of characters surrounding him could fit right in with Joker, Riddler, Penguin, and Lex Luthor. Trump has existed on the outskirts of American celebrity and popular culture for the lifespans of most Americans under the age of 40. He made cameos in movies like Home Alone 2 and on TV shows such as The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. He was in the guest chair on The Phil Donahue Show and The Oprah Winfrey Show, and he performed mock fights with World Wrestling Entertainment Chairman Vince McMahon on multiple episodes of WrestleMania. He even pretended to buy WWE's lucrative Monday Night Raw franchise in an elaborate ruse in 2009, which tanked the entertainment company's stock price, prompting Trump to quickly pretend to sell it back for twice the price. Despite his history of housing discrimination against black tenants and his full-page ad in the 1980s calling for a group of black and brown teenagers to be put to death for a gang rape they didn't commit, Trump managed to work his way into mainstream popular culture. Early on, he was a tabloid-friendly rogue and celebrity hanger-on, and later the king of the B-list stars who jockeyed for his approval on Celebrity Apprentice. Had he not signed on to the racist birther conspiracy claiming that America's first black president, Barack Obama, was not born in the United States, and plunged headfirst into the morass of anti-immigrant xenophobia that helped him win the presidency, the old Donald Trump might have carried on. He may have remained a cultural gadfly, that peculiar brand of celebrity whose views on everything from geopolitics to the Oscars are sought out for no particular reason other than that he is famous and quotable. But Donald Trump did become president, and so here we are. As a candidate, Trump offered Republicans the taste of the celebrity status that Ronald Reagan had given them, something normally reserved for Democrats. That's what attracted Sam Nunberg, the 38-year-old political advisor who toiled on Trump's warm-up attempts at presidential runs and on the real presidential deal until he lost a war with Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski and was fired in the summer of 2015. Nunberg says Lewandowski saw to it that old racist posts on his Facebook page surfaced. He later apologized for those posts. And though Nunberg readily says that Trump screwed him, he claims he'd vote for him again in 2020 because Trump has delivered on Republican policies and judicial nominations. I knew our campaign wasn't doing well when I went into our restaurant after he announced, Nunberg said, or was doing well, excuse me. The TV was on CNN and he was on and people were watching. These were people who normally wouldn't give a S word, but they were watching him. Trump wasn't just another politician doing a TV hit. He was an American mogul, an entertainer, Nunberg said. And he wasn't rich from making microchips or selling stocks. It was from building, construction. It was this image of success, of him being rich and he can make you rich. We were the WWE, Fox News version of the Obama campaign in the beginning, and I mean that as a compliment. It was aspirational. It was, we can fight the system. Nunberg was raised on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and nurtured on conservative talk radio's strident support for Israel and suspicion of the Middle East. After volunteering for Mitt Romney's 2008 campaign, he worked for right-wing lawyer Jay Sekulow during the 2010 fight to prevent the construction of a mosque near Ground Zero, the site of 9/11. He says Trump wrote a BS letter at the time offering to buy the land where the mosque was to be built, but the offer was just a PR stunt. Nunberg's parents were lawyers, and so he became one too. His father had worked for a law firm that Trump and his father had used for real estate deals. But Nunberg didn't meet Trump in person until he was introduced to him in 2010 by yet another Gotham City character, Roger Stone, the villain with the Richard Nixon tattoo on his back. I wanted to win a national election and thought Trump could win, Nunberg says of his eagerness to sign on. I thought it was cool that Obama went on the late night shows. I thought the John McCain ad showing Obama speaking to millions of people and showing Paris Hilton slamming him as a Hollywood celebrity was the dumbest effing thing I'd ever seen. He said he all but screamed at the time, "You just won him millions of votes." Nunberg thought his party was living in the 1950s. And though Trump was his own version of the madman era, to Nunberg, he was a madman for the 21st century. He and Trump shared a sensibility. He likens to a retired New York City firefighter or cop who mainlines Fox News, plus Rush Limbaugh and Mike Levin on talk radio, and thinks to himself, This country's gone to crap, and we need a guy in the White House who's willing to punch a few holes in the wall. It's Joyanne Reed's book, The Man Who Sold Him.
Coming up on the Science Revolution, as the Georgia governor rolled out a new death panel coronavirus plan, Dr. Andrew Glickson is here on the coronavirus versus climate extinction. While we're dealing with COVID-19, we're also hurtling toward extinction. Dr. Justin Frank drops by saying Trump could see dead bodies from coronavirus and just step over them. What? Also, Greg Palast explains the secret history of the Deepwater Horizon, BP's second blowout. It's the 10th anniversary for Deepwater Horizon's debacle. Find the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. We have new unemployment numbers out, by the way. We have over 30 million people who have become unemployed in the last 6 weeks. That's almost 20%, 18.6% of the U.S. labor force. That is Great Depression territory. Over 20%, you're in a depression. And but the stock market is still doing well. Why is that? Well, we'll talk to Richard Wolff about that in the next hour. And you know, I've shared some of my thoughts on this with you in the past. We'll get back to those too. But let's pick up some of your phone calls here. Jessica in Riverside, Illinois. Hey, Jessica, what's up? What's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. I think a war would be ridiculous. On Democracy Now!, they stated that 1 million people are going to have this virus around the world. And I can picture Trump ordering troops on the ground in Iran. I can just picture that, right? But also, I wanted to say the idiot's son-in-law needs to wear a hat when he says the federal government rose to that challenge, and this is a great success story. He needs a hat with the death tolls on it and with the unemployment numbers on it to show what a great job he's done. Of course, that would be subject to change on the numbers of how many more we have.
60,000 dead, 30 million unemployed. It's mind-boggling. Jessica, excellent. Thank you very much for your thoughts. And
one last thing.
Okay.
The workers at the meat plants need to go on strike so that they can go back in time and have unions again.
Yeah, the problem is that about half of them are Hispanic and about a quarter are black. The average wage is around $15 an hour. These are people who are living, in many cases, on the margins of society. For many of the Hispanics, the legal margins of society. For pretty much everybody else, including poor white people working in those plants, which is a little less than a quarter, they're living in the economic margins of society, and they don't feel that they can protest. In fact, they're not even calling in sick in large numbers. It's people are desperate for a job, which is the real tragedy of this. We used to have, and Jessica, thank you for the call. We used to have these used to be good union jobs. Meatpacking plants. Meatpacking plants used to pay what in today's dollars would probably be $40 an hour. But, now they pay $15 an hour. In some cases, they pay as little as $10 an hour. And you're standing there with a very, very sharp knife all day long cutting meat. And what are we made of? We're meat. I mean, the accidents are huge. The number of, people who get killed and wounded and things in these plants it's very dangerous work. It's statistically, it's more dangerous than being a cop. And it's really unfortunate what's going on. Anyhow, Al in Indianapolis, Indiana. Hey, Al, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Good afternoon. Love your show. Hey, I just want to say that I am absolutely convinced, 100%, that Trump is going to go all in to do anything he can to save his butt. Because I grew up in New York and I saw everything that he did. My father was in the trades. He saw all these Trump trade, how Trump swindled his all the thousands of tradesmen. I lost my job because of a company he bankrupted, and I watched all this other stuff. If he loses this election, everything he's ever done will come out in the open, and everything he's been trying to hide, everything he had Roy Cohen to hide 4 years ago, that's all going to come out. He's literally fighting for his life, and he is literally in the corner like a cornered rat. I expect he's going to go all out and we're all going to pay for it.
Well, and in the last days, I mean, this is what Hitler did. Let's charge to Moscow, and that was his undoing. It was a suicide move. It was a desperate suicide move. But Hitler was willing to take his country down along with him, and he largely did. And my biggest fear is that you're right, Al, that Donald Trump will do the same thing, that he's willing to risk World War III. He's willing to risk the death of hundreds of millions, perhaps the end of all life on this planet, in order to get himself reelected or to avoid going to prison, or just more broadly to avoid being exposed as a fraud and a grifter, and as a guy who not only is not a billionaire, is not even a millionaire, is actually in debt, at a level that's higher than all his assets. He's broke. He's been broke since the 90s, as David K. Johnston keeps pointing out, and bringing the receipts to prove. So I'm with you, Al. I'm very, very concerned about this, and this is why we need strong congressional leadership. Al, I got to move on, but thank you for the call. Well said. Adam in Youngstown, Ohio. Hey, Adam, what's on your mind?
Mr. Tom, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm fine. What's up?
Question for you. I just wondered if you can trace this back to a source for me. I was on the phone a couple hours ago with a mortgage agent. I've been passed along to 6 different ones over the past 19 years, and they're saying they're saying they didn't get a payment that they got, and I have to show burden of proof that I sent the payment. I sent it through my Gmail, and the woman asked for some TCK code or something like that, confirmation that it was sent. I get onto Google, and it blocks me. And it says you have to agree to the terms and conditions before we'll even let you access your Gmail. And every smart device we have, every app you get, you have to agree to these terms and conditions. Does this go to net neutrality? Does it go back to the Telecommunications Reform Act of 96? Is it Citizens United?
No.
What has taken away our freedoms so that we can't opt out of that?
There's kind of 2 pieces to this. One has to do with forced arbitration, which is typically part of these agreements. But more broadly, this is a debate that goes back to the late 1980s when Microsoft rolled out the first. These are called shrink wrap contracts or shrink wrap agreements that basically said, back when software was delivered on floppy disks and then later on CDs, that by opening this package, you are agreeing to the following terms and conditions. And, it has become the norm. And basically your only option is to say, no, I don't want to play. And if you read the terms and conditions, you'll find that they're insanely lopsidedly, on behalf of the big corporation.
Completely. From third-party subsidiaries to owning your information.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and this, yes, Google owns your mail, as do all the other mail providers, except there's a few like Proton Mail, that are secure mail, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. But this is pervasive. Yeah. It's huge, and the only way that we're going to get a handle on this is legislatively, and as long as the GOP controls any branch of government. Or for that matter, the judiciary, it's probably not going to happen because this benefits corporations and makes it almost impossible for average Americans to know what these corporations are doing with our information. Facebook is notorious for this. You have to sign terms and conditions to join Facebook, and B, sue them. It makes it virtually impossible. Adam, I got to move along, but good luck. Peg in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Hey, Peg, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. I live here in a pretty red district, and I've been able to work from home most of the time, but I had to go into the office this week, and people there are really, restless. Let's open this up. Let's get back to work. I want to go out to eat again, that kind of stuff. And what I'm realizing is we are not feeling the effects of the COVID pandemic. We don't know anybody who's died. And so I was trying to think of ideas of how to, bring the number. 60,000 is a lot of people. And I was trying to think of how I can bring the number of people to light. And, I do websites. I was thinking, well, just put, an honorarium up and all these people. And then I realized you can't do that because, you publish the names and you get into all kinds of trouble. And I was wondering if you had any ideas.
I think that the media needs to be. Louise and I were talking about this yesterday. I said we need a Kate Steinle. Do you know who Kate Steinle was, Peck?
No.
Okay, you don't watch Fox News. Back about a year and a half, 2 years ago, there was this nice, attractive, middle-class white woman. And I think she was on a boardwalk in California. I forget which city. I think it might have been in San Francisco, but whatever. She was out publicly, and a guy who was a, quote, illegal immigrant, an undocumented person in this country, was carrying a gun. and he dropped the gun, accidentally dropped the gun. It fell out of his pocket onto the ground and discharged and shot and killed Kate Steinle. And for months, every single day on right-wing hate radio, right across the board, all these guys, Hannity, Limbaugh, all these guys, and Fox News were doing profiles of Kate Steinle. Let's talk to Kate Steinle's family. Let's talk about what a wonderful person she was, how horrible it was that this evil, this evil, illegal, alien killed her. And it's all because it's a sanctuary city. I mean, it's just all this insane outrage. If you say Kate Steinle to 100 people, and 30 of them will say, I know who that is. Those are the people who watch Fox News and listen to right-wing hate radio. We need a Kate Steinle. We need a face for this virus. We need, and it needs to be publicized, and it probably should be a person who is, given the political power of the white middle class. It should probably be a member of the white middle class. And, Chuck Schumer is holding a press conference today about the impact of COVID on communities of color, which is really important, and we need legislative relief for that. But what he needs to be publicizing is that white guys like, the Proud Boys can get this and die from it too. And, frankly, it is a public relations strategy. That's what I think. I think that, and I haven't seen that person in the media. We need to find them, or the media needs to find them. Peg, thanks so much for the call. We'll be right back. It's 45 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And we'll be back with more of your calls on your thoughts on, well, pretty much anything you want to talk about, but also, is Trump going to get away with this, do you think? Is he going to start a war? And welcome back. Jonathan in Portland. Hey, Jonathan, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I wanted to bring out the fact that by January 12th, the United States had its first case, and in the month of January, we had about 50 cases, according to the CDC. And that somehow has been changed in a way, if you based on the reporting that we're hearing, that it's been in February or March, but the CDC moved all that information from their website. And the reason they gave was they said that it was no longer relevant to understanding the current situation, which is like Steve Mnuchin saying that unemployment's not relevant to the economy. And if you look at the graphs on the page, the graphs appear as if the cases started in the beginning of March. But I think that's important to bring out. Pardon?
Well, the deaths in a big way started in the beginning of March, but are you looking at a graph of deaths or of infections?
We had 50 cases in the United States starting January 12th on the CDC's website, and that started January 12th.
I'm just asking, Jonathan, if the current website is comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges. Are we comparing?
The current website doesn't even have the data on it. They have two separate pages, and the primary page actually starts from late February. So they've just shunted all of this over to the side, and I'm reading all different kinds of things in the press. I read just the other day that the first case started in San Francisco in February. Even the New York Times now has an article about the genome, how it mutates, and how the first case was in January 15th. But they don't really say that there were 50 cases in the month of January. So I just think I just wonder, why is the CDC doing this? Why are reporters getting this all wrong? Why can't they get the basic facts straight? And I don't know why, but it just seems to me that it's in somebody's interest to make it appear as if the cases started later.
Yeah, the CDC is not going to put something on their website that reflects poorly on Trump. That's just the bottom line. But if they're skewing their data to not just not reflect poorly on him, but to follow some sort of bizarre narrative that he's promoting, that's troubling. I'm on their website right now, cdc.gov. And I'm not finding any numbers.
So if you type in previous U.S. COVID-19 case data, previous previous U.S. COVID-19 case data, and it'll say January 12th, onset January 12th. And then the graph appears as if there's nothing there, but if you look under it, there are columns where the cases begin, and the first case in the column is actually on the 14th.
On March 10th. Yeah, I'm looking at that. These are the number of new cases since the beginning of the outbreak. Their graph starts on February 25th.
That's current one, right? That's not, and if you scroll down the bottom of the page, it'll say the data's been moved, and it'll say go to this page, and then if you go to that page where the data's been moved, you'll see they've just hidden it.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's basically a cover-up. I'm astonished. Thanks for pointing that out to me, Jonathan. That's mind-boggling. Thank you. Whew. It never stops with this administration, right? I mean, this is like he's starting to behave like Joe Stalin. We'll be back. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the end. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980 and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Marcia in Fairfield, Iowa. Hey, Marcia, you guys are really at the center of a lot that's going on around this thing. What's up?
Yes, we are. We've had to deal with CAFOs and much, much more. I watch your show a lot, and I just wanted to say there are so many levels that you need to look at this whole crisis with. But the biggest one, I think, that might affect the most people to actually react and do something and care is the human level. And when I heard about Governor Kim Reynolds' order that workers had to go to work, and if they didn't go to work, that they were going to not be able to get unemployment, that was just like, okay, honey, you go to work in that factory for a day or for an hour even. So, I think back, I'm a little bit older, and I think back to the days where there were people cared about the pickers in California with the big strike against grape.
Yeah, Cesar Chavez.
So yes. So I'm thinking, okay, A, we quit buying meat, and B, the workers quit, but they need to be supported somehow. And there have been all these concerts on TV recently where people could actually donate money to support these workers in the meantime, and hopefully a little extra money left over for the hospital workers and for their medical bills. But people, this is enough of a thing, enough of a crisis humanly, I'm hoping, to trigger a reaction.
It's not going, the amount of private philanthropy that would be necessary is just to the moon, Alice. I mean, it's over the top.
Right.
Yeah, for example,
I'm just saying that.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying I hear what you're saying. It takes a great deal, but certain things trigger humans, and to lay it out in very human terms, how would you like to go to this factory? And I'm just hoping that.
I think what we need to be doing, though, rather than trying to raise money for these individual workers, is we need to be applying political pressure on our politicians. It's going to take literally trillions of dollars, trillions, and there's no way that you can raise that kind of money with farm aid concerts or worker aid concerts and things like that.
Even if you
certainly
could
we need to be doing those
one
things to raise publicity.
Even if you could shut down one plant in Black Hawk, Iowa, make one prime example that was highly successful, you can tell that the sheriff that was talking about this, he was mortified what was happening under his watch. And he spoke in such political terms, my hat goes off to him. But in reality, he doesn't want these plants in his community. He doesn't want all this going on.
No, they're going to come. These workers are going to go back home, and they're going to infect their families, and their kids are going to play with his kids, and they're going to infect him. I mean, this is not rocket science.
And guess where all the pork, which to me is disgusting, but all that goes to China.
Yeah,
all
well,
the risks
Smithfield is
here,
owned by
and-
China. This is a Chinese-owned company. Marcia, thank you for the call. Spot on. Richard in Bellevue, Washington. Hey, Richard, what's up?
Hello, Tom. This deal, President Trump is putting out an order that's completely unenforceable. It's just another daily smokescreen. He can't force the meat plants to go ahead and open up. If the workers go in and they get sick, then they won't be coming back to work. If they go in and die, they won't come back to work. If the owners can't go ahead and force workers in there to go ahead and perform duties.
No, they're not going to force them at gunpoint, Richard, but what they're doing is they're saying you will not qualify for unemployment benefits and presumably thus also other state benefits. You will not qualify for these benefits if you don't show up for work. And that's the tool. And I would say that that's economic coercion that is every bit as vigorous as coercion at the point of a barrel of a gun, or nearly as much.
What good are benefits if your kids or you are going to get sick and possibly die? So, in other words, there is a choice there, and then what's he going to do? Send in the National Guard?
Yeah, it's not a choice that I think any of us would choose to make. Richard, thank you. Jose in Toledo, Ohio. Hey, Jose, what's up?
Well, I was just going to comment on will we go to war in order to save his election? I'd say yes. He'll do anything. This man is going to get what he wants. The silver spoon isn't doing him any good, so he's going to have to find a way to do it. I mean, even the example that he said, hey, 60,000 dead is acceptable. I think he said that a couple of weeks ago. And here we are.
If we have 60,000 dead, we did a good job.
Right. And that's just like, I know this guy at work. He says, okay, I'll have this ready for you by Friday. But he knows damn well he could do it by tomorrow. But he's given himself all this room. And if he doesn't make it by tomorrow, then he's still a good guy. He's setting this number up so that people, we're doing good. He's putting it in their head. This man will do anything at all.
It's called moving the goalposts.
Right. And unfortunately, people fall for that. Unfortunately, I don't know.
I'm starting to think, Jose, that if Trump starts a quote small war, he has as Richard Clarke pointed out at the top of the hour, he has instructed the military in the Persian Gulf to be more aggressive toward the Iranian military, and take what might be an otherwise ignored incident and try to turn it into a conflict. If that happens, and if he gets the little war that he wants with Iran, I don't think Americans are going to rally around the flag like they have in previous BS wars, whether it was the Gulf of Tonkin, where LBJ lied to us, or whether it was invading Afghanistan and Iraq, where George W. Bush and Dick Cheney lied to us. We figured out those lies in retrospect. I think that people are anticipating lies in advance right now. I think this is part of why Trump's approval rating is so low. He's down in the 30s, 38, 39%. I mean, that's mind-boggling.
I truly hope you're right, Tom, because this guy,
I think Americans are waking up. I don't think that's going to stop him from trying to do it, though, Jose, and that's what scares the hell out of me and has me very, very concerned. I mean, he's sitting on the largest nuclear arsenal in the world and the biggest military in the world, and I don't think he's afraid to use it. Jose, thank you for the call. We'll be back. Stick around. We're gonna check in with Professor Richard Wolff and find out what's going on in the economy.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
So every week we do a special video for supporters of our program. It's available over at thomhartmann.com. And, it's a private video. And this week I'm talking about the relationship between Donald Trump and Fox News. Trump's recent liberate these states with Democratic governors tweets, which seem to be actually calling for like armed revolt or asking, his crazy followers to let's send some pipe bombs or something like one already has to Democrats. He did that 2 minutes after watching a Fox News segment basically saying the same thing. Fox News is programming the brain of the president, and their programming was, basically developed by Roger Ailes to infuriate people. This outrage as a way of holding people so that they can sell advertising. And it's doing harm to our republic. You can check the whole thing out, the whole new video, over at thomhartmann.com.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Animal Kind, Remarkable Discoveries About Animals and Revolutionary Ways to Show Them Compassion by Ingrid Newkirk and Jean Stone. This is from the very first chapter. Researchers at Germany's Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology were dumbfounded. The excitement wasn't over a new fossil or the discovery of a previously unknown human ancestor. It was over Rico, a border collie. In experiments conducted in 2004, the very normal-seeming 10-year-old canine had learned to fetch more than 200 objects on command, and moreover, remembered them all a month later. Determined to discover the limits of Rico's abilities, the research team subjected him to a battery of cognitive tests that revealed astounding problem-solving abilities. Rico could easily retrieve from another room items he was familiar with, but when told to retrieve a new item, one he had never heard before, Rico correctly deduced that the unknown name must correspond with an unknown object, and correctly retrieved it. The Border Collie's cognitive abilities were subsequently compared to that of apes, dolphins, parrots, and eventually human children. Researchers often end up comparing their animal subjects' intelligence to humans, but is intelligence truly easy to compare, animal to human, or even animal to animal? If Rico could use the process of elimination to correctly fetch a tennis ball, does that make him smarter than an Arctic tern who journeys 44,000 miles each year between the North and South Poles? Is a piano-playing cat more intelligent than a chimpanzee who shares 99% of her DNA with humans and can learn sign language? Comparing the intelligence of animals is, in fact, no easier than comparing the intelligence of humans. Who's smarter, Aristotle or Plato, Newton or Einstein, Monet or Manet, the red-lipped batfish or Chinese giant salamanders, the Indian elephant or the African elephant? In the end, ranking the relative intelligence of animals is a futile exercise. What's more, a recent study found that less than 15% of the estimated 9 million species on Earth have been discovered. Who knows what fantastical creatures reside at our ocean's crushing depths, soar high in the stratosphere, or creep deep in the densest jungles? What fantastic intelligence do they display? Or, more so, what fantastic intelligence we can't even comprehend? We often consider intelligence as the only factor in determining which animals deserve compassion and which don't. Yet we're still so limited in our understanding of human intelligence that it makes little sense to calibrate our animal brethren based on how similar their brains are to ours. Or perhaps you could say it's simply not an intelligent way to determine importance. The goal of this book is not to merely question that superiority or to show that animals think and act like us. It's to show how they do not and to honor those differences. How can anyone compare the mental faculties of a gibbon vaulting through the forest with a giant blue whale singing through the deepest oceans? Different animals excel at different actions. As we'll see in this book, animals think, navigate, communicate, love, and play in extraordinarily unique ways. However, for many years, scientists believed that intelligence was indeed all that mattered when it came to animals, and that intelligence consisted of a continuum with humans at the most developed end. Every other species could fit neatly into that spectrum, a concept heralded by the great naturalist Charles Darwin, who wrote in his 1871 book, The Descent of Man, that, quote, "The difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind," end quote. In essence, Darwin meant that because all animals share a common ancestor, they also share the same toolkit of mental abilities, but at different levels. Not a new idea. 2,400 years ago, Aristotle presented his idea of natural ladder, or scala natura. Like Darwin, Aristotle advanced that all life could be conveniently ranked, with lesser animals like worms on one end, intermediate animals like dogs and cats in the middle, and higher animals such as monkeys and humans at the far end. During the Middle Ages, Christian theologians expanded on Aristotle's teachings with the great chain of being, a hierarchical scale that began with God at the very top, followed by angels, humans, other animals, plants, and then minerals. Each layer of the chain also had its own hierarchy. Among humans, for instance, kings, aristocrats, and other noblemen were at the top, while peasants were relegated to the bottom. The highest-ranking animals were large carnivores like lions and tigers, who were untrainable and therefore seen as superior to docile animals like dogs and horses. Even insects were subdivided, with honey-producing bees ranked higher than mosquitoes and plant-eating beetles. Finally, at the very bottom sat snakes, their lowly station, a result of the serpent's deception in the Garden of Eden. Even throughout the 20th century, scientists clung to the notion that animals could be neatly ranked by their human intelligence. Scientists devised increasingly cruel experiments that could serve as universal tests for animal cognition, many of them led by University of Wisconsin-Madison psychologist Harry Harlow. Previously, Harlow was best known for a series of experiments from the 1950s, in which he removed infant rhesus monkeys from their mothers and provided them surrogate mothers made from wire. The traumatized monkeys' desperate attempts to be caressed by their inanimate mothers during times of stress became the basis for research into maternal separation, dependency needs, and social isolations. Many historians cite Harlow as a factor in the rise of subsequent animal liberation movements. Later, Harlow developed experiments called learning sets, which effectively tested how well a subject could learn. For instance, an animal would be presented with two doors, one containing food. The test would be repeated until the animal learned the correct door. Much like Aristotle's Scala Naturae, it continues. Animal Kind is the book by Newkirk and Stone.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program. On the line with us is Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, the co-founder of democracyatwork.info, author of numerous books, his most recent, Understanding Socialism. In addition to democracyatwork.info, he also has a website at rdwolff with 2fs.com. And his Twitter handle is Prof. Wolff, as in Professor Wolff. Professor Wolff, welcome back. I'm so glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
So, I'm seeing that the Fed now has $6 trillion on its balance sheet, most of this in corporate bonds. And that seems to be floating the economy. William Cohen was writing about this in the, the New York Times or the Washington Post a day or so ago. And I'm trying to make sense of all this. And he talks about on March 23rd, the Fed put together an array of loans and other forms of credit totaling $4 trillion. On April 9th, the Fed struck again, providing an additional $2.3 trillion. So now it's $6.3 on their balance sheet. And now they're holding $3.7 trillion in credit assets. He goes on that as a result of this, companies like Yum Brands that owns KFC and Pizza Hut, they issued $600 million in new debt. The Fed bought it all. Cruise ship company Carnival issued $4 billion in new debt. The Fed bought it all. Basically, the Fed is supporting all these companies. And it seems to me that the stock market has decoupled itself as a result of this. I mean, $6 trillion is like half the entire, or maybe a third of the entire GDP of the United States. It's it's twice the federal budget. It's a massive amount of money for the Fed to pour into the economy, particularly when it's pouring it all into just a couple of thousand giant corporations. Is it fair to say that the stock market is no longer an indicator of the economy? Arguably never really was, but certainly is not coupled to the economy the way it was back in the 1930s. And if so, what does that mean for average people?
Okay, let's do it step by step. Short answer to your first question, yes, the stock market is now more decoupled, more disconnected from the underlying economy of producing and distributing goods and services than probably at any time in its history. It's never 100%. The stock market is interconnected with the rest of our economy and vice versa, so there's always some linkage. But what we're seeing now is a more attenuated, a more stretched out linkage. Nor is there any mystery about it. Here's the basic process. The federal government, through the agency of the Federal Reserve, is in full panic mode. If there's any basic point I can get across, it's that the view now is we are on the edge of a precipitous collapse of our economy and society. Therefore, anything and everything that can be done must be done. Because if we don't get through this, then worrying about this or that longer-term effect won't make any difference. A little bit like a presidential candidate understanding that unless he or she gets through the primary, there's really not much point in worrying about the general election. So the Fed is panicked, the government is panicked, and they've decided to do what they did in the aftermath of the crashes of 2000, so-called dot-com crash, and the crash of 2008, the so-called subprime mortgage. In both cases, they flooded the economy with money. Now, in retrospect, it looks like relatively small increases compared to the gigantic one we're in now. But this crisis being bigger, they decided to do the same thing, only more so, and that's what they are doing. So think of it this way. Massive amounts of money coming into the corporate sector, into the U.S. government directly when securities from banks, from insurance companies, or as it may begin to do directly from the Fed. You have a vast amount of new money literally being created on the bank, on the checking accounts of these big corporations, because that's how this is done. And now the question is, where is the money going to go? If all of that money were to go into the economy, trying to buy goods and services, we would have the spectacular inflation that everybody has always worried about. Our output of goods and services these days is precipitously going down. We have over 30 million people unemployed. If at the same time that the supply of goods and services is going down because people are not working, but the quantity of money coming into the economy is zooming up, you would have the classic case of too much money chasing after too few goods, and up would go prices. That's not happening. And the reason is no company has any incentive to hire anybody. No company has any incentive to invest in producing goods when the soaring unemployment guarantees you will not be able to sell your goods. So where is the money going to go if it makes no sense for private capitalists to hire people, produce goods when the market has collapsed? And the answer is the stock market. It's the one place you can now go where you can buy something and hope that it's worth more 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 months from now than when you paid, when you bought it. And because there's so much money flooding in, this craziness is in fact rational, because there is so much money that you probably will find someone 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 10 weeks from now who will buy whatever stock you purchase today with all this fresh new money, and will buy it in order to play the same game in turn that you've just played with that person. And so you have what is classically and will soon be called a stock market bubble happening at the same time that the underlying real economy is collapsing with massive unemployment, shutdown of production, closed stores and factories and offices everywhere. And indeed, the two phenomena which would appear to be in contradiction aren't, because it's the very shutdown of the real production of goods and services that is diverting all of the extra money into the stock market because it's the only place where the people who get that money can make a profit by buying and selling stocks. And so the inflation that people said didn't show up, that's a mistake. It did show up. It didn't show up in the market for goods and services because all that money got diverted to the stock market. But that's why the stock market has been doing well in the period after the 2008 crisis, and even in the last 2 or 3 weeks, as the unemployment was going crazy, the stock market was going up too, and that's an undeniable demonstration of a disconnect.
So this $6 trillion that the Fed has manufactured out of thin air, if that was given to 100 million working families, and there's 130 million, working households in the country, but I'll use 100 million because I can do the math that way, that would be $60,000 per family all across the United States. They could have simply given every family in America 60 grand. Obviously they didn't. That money went to fewer than 2,000 corporations. And in terms of the stock market going up, the major benefit of that is going to fewer than 200,000 wealthy American families. Would it be safe to say that all of this is bailing out the rich at the expense of all the rest of us?
Absolutely. It is a classic example of what we used to call trickle-down economics. You're helping the people at the top, rich people, corporations, and then you're telling yourself a fanciful story that it will trickle down, which it never did.
Professor Wolff, we're hitting this break. I thank you for agreeing to stay with us for a half hour. We'll continue this conversation with Professor Wolff in just a moment.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Professor Richard Wolff is with us for the half hour. His website is democracyatwork.info and rdwolf.com. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff. Welcome back. So, Professor Wolff, I believe that I have read at least 3 op-eds, editorials, or news stories in the Financial Times over the last month, either speculating or outright asserting that what the Fed is doing in buying these corporate bonds, particularly as they get into junk grade bonds, like they just bought a whole bunch of Ford's bonds, is not legal. It's not part of their charter, essentially. I'd like to get your thoughts on that, and also why is Jerome Powell doing this, given the massive potential downside of inflation and crashing and asset bubbles here? Is it because he's just simply been intimidated by Donald Trump? He was acting like a good Fed chief at first, and then Trump started regularly trashing him on Twitter. I mean, do we have a cowed Fed?
Well, I think, again, the two questions are separate. The first question, basically, the rule books, the limits, the traditions are out the window. We've not had a crash of capitalism this bad in probably nearly a century. And the combination that the trigger this time happened to be a virus rather than people not paying mortgages or rather than overpriced .com stocks back in 2000, this confluence of a health crisis and another capitalist crash, it's a little bit overwhelming and too much. They had a tradition of mainly dealing in government securities, the Federal Reserve, buying and selling them, but things are so crashed now that they can't just do that. They have to pump in much more money, and so they've extended it and buying corporate bonds. Whether there is or isn't a rule at this point on that really doesn't matter, because they are so desperate to flood the economy with money because they're not willing to consider any other policy option, that's really not much of an option left. They have to buy corporate bonds. And the fear about the inflation is, of course, reasonable. First of all, this money, as I said before, is flooding into the stock market, creating a wild disconnect, meaning that prices in the stocks really have nothing to do with the underlying economy. have a life of their own, and the minute anything happens to threaten the endless pumping of money, you run the risk of a collapse in the stock market, which will indeed have all kinds of effects on the economy. So this is a very dangerous game, and it can only be explained by the level of panic about how disastrous the current situation is, and I think that's the basic message. You did raise earlier that there are other policies like trickle-up economics, giving the money to everybody, particularly the poor, those who have the least, to get them through this, because we know that they will spend every nickel that the government gives them and thereby stimulate the demand side of the economy. We do have a special problem because it is unsafe at this point for large numbers of people to go to work. Therefore, what the policy ought to be would be a combination of trickle up, give people at the bottom the money with which to create a demand, and secondly, order the society to clean up the workplaces with the testing and the masks and everything else to enable the economy to go. This government isn't doing either of those things. That's the tragedy.
Okay. We'll be right back with more of Professor Wolff in just a moment. His most recent book, Understanding Socialism. We do it as a book report here from time to time. It's brilliant. We'll be right back. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. We're talking with Professor Richard Wolff. His latest book, Understanding Socialism. His website's democracyatwork.info and rdwolf.com. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff. Professor Wolff, I was reading a piece in the Financial Times this morning about the repo market. It was a rather lengthy piece, actually. And one of the points that they made in there was this is the overnight, lending, basically that banks do with each other, swapping the cash for treasuries and things. And the Fed had started intervening back in September in a big way. And one of the points that this article made was that the reason that the Fed had to intervene in the repo market, or one of the main reasons, was that the Fed itself had been unwinding QE, the quantitative easing, the purchasing, basically flooding the money with the market with money by purchasing treasuries, that they were unwinding that and selling these things back into the marketplace. And it was creating a disequilibrium in the treasury market, and which interfered with the repo market. And if that's the case, and now the Fed's balance sheet has gone from $2 trillion, which was the consequence of the QE, to $6 trillion. How do they get out of this? How long can they maintain this? And how do they unwind it without all kinds of secondary systemic crashes like the repo market?
Absolutely. Bingo. You have the understanding. That's right. This is like a version of a Ponzi scheme. You keep the thing going by drawing more suckers into this game, fooling the original ones by using the money of the subsequent ones to keep the illusion going. They're flooding the market each time with more money. It leads to tremendous imbalances all over the place. And then they try to solve those by pushing in more money, which is a temporary fix, just like the Madoff plan. You temporarily satisfied the early investors by giving them a big chunk of what the later investors gave you. Eventually, when the moment comes that you can't do that, for whatever reason, then the jig is up and you can't continue. But they're so panicked that they can't think like that anymore. So you get that in the article you read when they realize the connection, but at this point they don't feel they have any option. And given who these people are, the Powells of the world, the Trumps, and the Democrats too for that matter, they think, and they've thought now for 40 years, that whatever the private sector does will work itself out, is the best way to go. Capitalism is the best thing since sliced bread. The job of the government is simply to get them through the rough patches when they occur. This mentality is what's blocking them from taking the steps they need. And now which is the most dangerous threat to capitalism I could imagine, and I'm a critic of it, telling the mass of the American people, we are going to force you back to work while we do not force the employers to create a safe workplace. This is a level of a choice between one disaster or another that the mass of people are slowly going to understand is the desperate final gasp of a system that can't give anyone anything other than two equally horrific choices. That's a system that's exhausted, and I think somewhere the Fed kind of knows it, doesn't know what else to do because of the way it thinks. It can't think a bottom-up strategy the way you described it, giving everybody the money, which, by the way, is what Franklin Roosevelt in part did in the 1930s. You don't have anyone in a position of power in either party who's willing at this point to go in that direction or offer it. The two folks who might have, Warren and Sanders, have been pushed out, so you're left with this accumulating set of dead ends.
Wow. So how does this play out in your opinion?
Well, in my opinion, we are in a series of I don't mean to be over dramatic here, but it's a kind of a death
Pretty
spiral.
dramatic time.
Yes, it is a dramatic time, so maybe I'm allowed. You responded to the dot-com crisis in 2000 by cutting interest rates to nothing and flooding the economy with money. What that meant was that every business in America for the last 20 years has had one way to solve all of its problems, whether it produced this wrong thing or chose the bad technology or is fighting with its employees. The cheapest, easiest way to get out of whatever mess you were in was to borrow virtually limitless amounts of money at a zero or near zero interest rate. So the corporate sector went crazy, overloading itself with debt, which is now offloading onto the Federal Reserve. I mean, no matter what your training, this is a crazy process in which the solution to the dot-com crisis in 2000 set the stage for lending money to the mass of people who couldn't afford a mortgage, so that collapsed in 2008, and now you're seeing the corporate collapse under the trigger of a virus which, instead of being handled as the medical problem it is, leads to a kind of collapse of the system. These are desperate, panic-driven acts of a system running itself out of gas. It is a terrible time, not least because the system and the people who lead it have no idea how to get out of this mess.
Well, I would think that they know about trickle-up. They're just unwilling to do it because they think it's something like socialism.
And they can't think their way through to saying our strategies have failed. We must change a basic direction. That's a difficult thing for leaders ever to do, and we're stuck with leaders who are probably less capable of thinking their way through and are therefore literally the conductor on a train headed right for a stone wall, and we're already at that point with 30 million people unemployed. If ever you needed a change of direction, that very fact should be the index you have to move.
Yeah, this is the band played on. This is the music on the Titanic. Amazing. Professor Richard Wolff, thanks so much for dropping by today and illuminating all these ideas and concepts for us and information. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Always great talking with you. We'll be right back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this. It's 28 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Stick around. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is ADHD, A Hunter in a Farmer's World by Thom Hartmann. This is from Chapter 3, Hunters in Our Schools and Offices, The Origin of ADHD. The earliest theories about attention deficit disorder characterized it as a diseased state that had to do with brain damage or dysfunction. At various times, it has been lumped in with fetal alcohol syndrome, mental retardation, various genetic mental illnesses, psychiatric disorders resulting from early trauma or childhood abuse, and the theory that parental smoking led to fetal oxygen deprivation. Prior to the 1970s, when ADHD was first characterized as a specific disorder, ADHD children and adults were largely treated simply as bad people, even though attentional deficits have been recognized in the psychological literature since 1905. They were the kids who always got into trouble, the James Deans of the world, the rootless and unsettled adults like Abraham Lincoln's father, the Lone Ranger, or John Dillinger. More recent research, however, has demonstrated a high incidence of ADHD among the parents of ADHD kids. This discovery caused some psychologists to initially postulate that ADHD was the result of growing up in a dysfunctional family. They suggested that ADHD may follow the same pattern as child or spousal abuse, moving through generations as learned behavior. The dietary-causing advocates contended that children's pattern their parents' eating habits, and this accounts for the generational patterns of ADHD. Other studies suggest that, like Down syndrome or muscular dystrophy, ADHD is a genetic disease, and a specific gene, the A1 variant of the D2 dopamine receptor gene, has been identified by scientists as the leading candidate. But if ADHD is a genetic disease or an abnormality, it's a popular one, possibly afflicting as many as 25 million individuals in the United States. Some estimates put ADHD as occurring in 20% of males and 5% of females. Other estimates are much lower, hitting a bottom of 3% of males and 0.5% of females. With such a wide distribution among our population, is it reasonable to assume that ADHD is simply a quirk, that it's some sort of aberration caused by defective genes or child abuse? When the condition is so widely distributed, inevitable questions arise. Why? Where did ADHD come from? The answer is, people with ADHD are the leftover hunters, those whose ancestors evolved and matured thousands of years in the past in hunting societies. There is ample precedent for genetic diseases, in quotes, that in fact represent evolutionary survival strategies. Sickle cell anemia, for example, is now known to make its victims less susceptible to malaria. When living in the jungles of Africa, where malaria is endemic, it was a powerful environmental tool against death by disease. In the malaria-free environment of North America, it became a liability. The same is true of Tay-Sachs disease, a genetic condition that hits mainly Eastern European Jews and confers on them a relative immunity to tuberculosis. And even cystic fibrosis, the deadly genetic disease common among Caucasians, 1 in 25 white Americans carries the gene, may represent a genetic adaptation. Recent research indicates the cystic fibrosis gene helps protect its victims at younger ages from death by such diarrheal diseases as cholera, which periodically swept Europe thousands of years ago. It's not so unusual, apparently, for humans to have built into our genetic material protection against local diseases and other environmental conditions. Certainly, Darwin's theory of natural selection argues in favor of such bodily defenses. Those individuals with immunities would survive to procreate and pass along their genetic material. As the human race moved from its earliest ancestors, two basic types of cultures evolved. In the areas that were lush with plant and animal life and had low human population density, hunters and gatherers predominated. In other parts of the world, particularly Asia, farming or agricultural societies evolved. Be it pursuing buffalo in North America, hunting deer in Europe, chasing wildebeest in Africa, or picking fish from a stream in Asia, these hunters needed a certain set of physical and mental characteristics to be successful. Number one, they constantly monitor their environment. That rustle in the bushes could be a lion or a coiled snake. Failure to be fully aware of the environment and notice that faint sound might mean a swift and painful death. Or that sound or flash of movement might be the animal the hunter was stalking, and noticing it would mean the difference between a full belly and hunger. I've walked through forests and jungles with modern hunter types in the United States, Europe, Australia, and East Africa, and one characteristic always struck me. They notice everything. A flipped-over stone, a tiny footprint, a distant sound, an odd smell in the air, the direction in which flowers point or moss grows. All these things have meaning to hunters, and even when walking quickly, they notice everything. Number two, they can totally throw themselves into the hunt. Time is elastic for them. Another characteristic of a good hunter is the ability to totally focus on the moment, utterly abandoning all consideration of any other time or place. When the hunter sees the prey, he gives chase through gully or ravine, over fields or through trees, giving no thought to the events of the day before, nor not considering the future, simply living totally in that one pure moment and immersing himself in it. When involved in the hunt, time seems to speed. When not in the hunt, time becomes slow. While a hunter's ability to concentrate in general may be low, his ability to utterly throw himself into the hunt at the moment is astonishing. 3, they're flexible, capable of changing strategy on a moment's notice. If the wild boar vanishes into the brush and a rabbit appears, the hunter is off in a new direction. The book ADHD, A Hunter in a Farmer's World by Thom Hartmann.
Coming up on the Science Revolution, as the Georgia governor rolled out a new death panel coronavirus plan, Dr. Andrew Glickson is here on the coronavirus versus climate extinction. While we're dealing with COVID-19, we're also hurtling toward extinction. Dr. Justin Frank drops by saying Trump could see dead bodies from coronavirus and just step over them. What? Also, Greg Palast explains the secret history of the Deepwater Horizon, BP's second blowout. It's the 10-year anniversary for Deepwater Horizon's debacle. Find the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and picking up your phone calls. Paul in Benton, Pennsylvania. Hey, Paul, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, hi, Tom. Going in the stores now, it's like we're required to wear masks here in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania, we have a Democratic governor, Tom Wolff, and a Democratic Lieutenant Governor, John Fetterman. And the signs on the doors, like, once in a while you come to one will say, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, required to wear a mask. But most of the stores I'm seeing, the signs are saying, like, under the orders of Governor Tom Wolff, you are required to wear a mask, and or by orders of the state governments requiring you to wear a mask. And it seems like it's fanning the flames for these Trumpers and these MAGA hatters, because everybody feels like they're inconvenienced because they have to wear a mask and clean their hands and everything, and you got to stand 6 feet apart. And it's like these things it just seems like the way it's worded, it's like so people direct their anger at the Democratic governor, lieutenant governor, and definitely not the Republican legislature, but it seems like it's directed at the governor. I've seen, a lot of things references to Governor Wolff, and like I said, I just think it's disgusting. It's like, there's no limit to how low they could actually go.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, Paul. If I lived in Pennsylvania, or I live here in Oregon, if I saw a sign that said, Governor Kate Brown has ordered that you must wear a mask in this place of business, I would think, good on her. So it might have a different effect depending on the audience, but I get, what you're saying, that you think that this is politically inspired. I mean, the governor could have included in his executive order that every store must post a sign, and that the state of Pennsylvania would supply the sign, and then they come up with a nice little sign that says, "Thank you so much for helping save lives in Pennsylvania. With our elderly and vulnerable citizens are very, very appreciative of your wearing a mask when you're in this store," or something like that. But still, you'd have right-wing folks posting their, screed against the governor right next to it. But, I get what you're saying, and, thanks for sharing the story. Brian in Roselle, Illinois. Hey, Brian, what's on your mind?
Speaking of right-wing propaganda, that was the reason I called. I have heard it on several of their outlets about their strategy is to try and blame this on China as much as possible. Right. And
this morning, Trump tried to blame it on Obama. He had a little presser there, and Jim Acosta from CNN asked him, something about the tests, and he says, when Obama left, he gave us broken tests. And it's like, what? There wasn't even this virus. It's like, right. But anyway, back to you, Brian. I'm sorry. Yes, he's trying to blame it on China.
He blames everybody for everything.
Pompeo. Yeah.
But what concerns me is our relationship with China has been horribly mismanaged since the 80s. The neoliberalism that I hear you rail about, and Bill Clinton did sign the trade bills, and he did give China WTO status, have been a disaster for America's working class. There's no two ways about it. Plus, like look at all of our pharmaceuticals now and all of our critical items we need for this pandemic. Well, we have to wait for it to come from China. I mean, I think the Democratic Party, maybe Joe Biden could start appointing cabinet members and put somebody on going on this trade issue. We've got to get this solved because the Republicans are going to demagogue it up one tree and down the other because they are desperate as can be to win the next election. And we've got to get a rational policy that makes sense for average Americans, front and center to take on the Chinese. Because this is going to continue. This is probably just going to get worse. And there's going to be other pandemics too. And we've got to start thinking about what makes sense for the American people instead of what's going to make the most money for the wealthy people in the world. And that's my
here's
point.
the problem, Brian, and this is how it played out. Up until the 1980s, and even through the 1980s, the Democratic Party was the party of labor and was basically a party of protectionism. Keep those tariffs in place. We had high tariffs on imported goods, at least imported goods that competed with things that we manufactured here in the United States. And it was the main reason. And those tariffs, by the way, were put into place by George Washington in 1793. And those kept in place by every president from George Washington to Ronald Reagan. Reagan came in, and Walmart and all these big retail businesses and the big manufacturers, they were all leaning on the Republican government saying, we want to move our manufacturing overseas. And Reagan negotiated, and then George Herbert Walker Bush actually finished the job. Reagan started the job of negotiating this whole thing about the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which led to the creation of the World Trade Organization, and the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. And those things were put together. They were Republican ideas. They were put together by a Republican administration. And tragically, Bill Clinton went against his own party and a 50-year history of his own party and signed off on that. And in fact, campaigned on it in 92, which is what brought Ross Perot out of the woodwork. And Ross Perot got 19.5% of the vote. And it was purely on this issue of trade. And that was 92. Americans knew which way the wind was blowing. And in my opinion, the only way the Democratic Party survives this is by going back to their protectionist roots. And the reason why Trump has not had any success, and we've had Peter Navarro on this program. I mean, long before he joined up with Trump and became crazy. But Navarro would make basically the same point I'm making, that we've got to get manufacturing back to the United States, and typically the way that you do that is with tariffs, particularly when you're competing with companies with lower wages and lower environmental standards and no unions. And so what the Democratic Party needs to do is basically repudiate what came to be Clintonism and embrace people like Sherrod Brown and Bernie Sanders, who have been fighting this fight on trade forever. And Sherrod Brown is perceived as a mainstream guy, but and Bernie, of course, is perceived as the left. But this is right across the Democratic Party. The entire party needs to say enough, because the reason Trump can't pull this off, Trump and Navarro can't pull this off, is because they're trying to do it by executive order. You can't do this by executive order. You've got to do it by Congress passing laws that support these tariffs. It has to be systemic. One president issuing an executive order to put tariffs on, car parts from China is not going to cause Delco to build a new factory in Michigan, because they're looking at a 20, 30, 40-year horizon for that investment, for a return on that investment. And with an executive order, it can be easily reversed by the next president. Whereas if Congress passes a law that's going to stand for the next 20 years, then Delco is going to build a factory. And if the Democrats don't get their act together on this soon, they're going to get trounced again. This was probably the major issue in the Midwest that caused Hillary Clinton not to win those states: Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And it's going to be a major issue this time around, although it's being eclipsed.
Quick point?
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Another problem is the Chinese money now has infiltrated our economy. The world's largest pork producer or packing house, United States, Smithfield Foods, is owned by China.
Is owned by the Chinese, right. And,
that's right.
And a large chunk of the real estate in California is owned by China.
They own huge agribusiness setups, all the hog producing facilities. They own those too. They own the shipping.
And they're being shipped to China. After
right, and now Chinese money is influencing the states and state senators in the Midwest, and it just goes on from there. I mean, we've been sold
should be outlawed.
goods.
Yeah,
and
no, I'm with you. This needs to be outlawed, and and if the Democratic Party doesn't go for this, they're in deep doo-doo. Brian, thank you for the call. Todd in Yucca Valley. Hey, Todd, what's up? Thanks for
Hey, hi, Tom. I greatly appreciate your show. I just have a quick question and a suggestion. My question is, why aren't the United States or state war bonds for this terrible pandemic not being offered?
Well, the war bonds that were issued, and we issued war bonds during the Civil War, we issued war bonds during World War I, and we issued war bonds during World War II. In all three cases, they did not raise enough money to significantly help the United States fight the war. They were basically PR efforts. There was some speculation that the ones during World War II were also to try to pull money out of the economy to prevent inflation. But I'm skeptical of that theory. But in any case, they were mostly In fact, I remember as a little kid in the 1950s going to elementary school, and we were still buying Liberty bonds. We'd put we had these little things that you put a dime in every week, and you bring the dime in, and everybody had one, and you'd buy at the whole class, or I don't remember exactly how it happened, but we were still buying war bonds. Those were basically wrung out of the economy by the end of the 50s and the early 60s, and now you can buy bonds. But I don't think that, there's so much money missing from the economy now. This isn't about war. This is about a Great Depression. And if you're going to people and asking them to kick in to help the government get us through a Great Depression, people just don't have the money. So, we need large systemic efforts like I was speaking about with Professor Wolff. But, it's a great question, Todd. It's a great question. And there's a fascinating history to the war bonds. Thanks a lot for the call. Great to hear from you. But it wouldn't be a solution to the problem. It is a way, though, that you rally people to a cause. But right now, Trump, he's such an incompetent leader, he couldn't rally anything.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Trump couldn't rally a pack of wild dogs if he was throwing stakes at them. We'll be back. It's 45 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. Valerie in Las Vegas. Hey, Valerie, what's on your mind today?
Hey, thanks for taking my call, Tom. I fear the worst. There's still more damage that this man can do between now and November.
Oh, yeah.
You're talking about possibly another war. I just read on Democratic Underground about an hour ago that the White House has ordered selective reserve units to active duty. Have you heard anything about that?
I have not. Let me go over to DU right now and take a look, but...
there's no source. There's no link either.
Right. Yeah, I don't see it in the top threads.
No.
But
I think it was under latest threads.
Yeah, latest threads. It's not there right now. But if you can find any source for that, I'll poke around and see what I can find. During the next break, at the top of the hour, and see if I can learn anything, because I just don't know off the top of my head, and I haven't seen that story. That would be alarming if that's the case, and something that we should all pay attention to. But I just don't know.
Are you as fearful as I am?
I'm not fearful. I am concerned. I don't find fear to be a real useful emotion right now, but and it tends to paralyze people, and I do not want to be paralyzed. But I do think that we need to be, ringing the bell. I don't think Paul Revere was fearful. I think he was alarmed, and we need to be alarmed at this point, right? We need to be ringing the bell.
Okay.
Valerie, thanks for the call. It's great to hear from you. Thank you. David in Los Angeles. Hey, David, what's on your mind?
Well, Tom, I hope I can get all this succinctly out to you. This next Trump or this next negotiation that's getting ready to occur, where Mitch already drew the lines on talking about He wants the states to go bankrupt, and he's hardlining already for this any more funds coming out. Now that he didn't gave them all to big corporate America, right?
Now Trump is threatening to screw with sanctuary cities. Back to you, David. I'm sorry.
You understand? So this time around, now I know the Democrats got us a little something out of these negotiations and these past Trumps, if you will. But this time around, there should be no negotiating. We need something out here for the people, not food banks, not no GoFundMe shit. No fundme stuff. We need that $2 trillion you're talking about to go into the pockets of the masses, right? No compromise, right?
Yeah. By the way, I think you dropped a nasty word there, David. My apologies to our listeners. Sean says she dumped it. Okay. Anyhow, continue, David.
My apologies. But where we're at right now with your concern, and I feel you on this. And, this GoFundMe type of government for the people, this got to come to a stop.
Yeah, it should have come to a stop, years ago when we saw that probably the majority, at least by dollar amounts, of GoFundMe pleas were people who had medical bills. I mean, that talk about a clue, right? That something is really, really wrong. David, spot on. I completely agree with you, and we'll see. But the pressure point are your Democratic members of Congress, and frankly, your Republican ones too. The number is 202-225-3121. That's the phone number for Congress. Give them a call. Raise some hell. We'll be back. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980, and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it, and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. So we've got a new video up for regular supporters of our program over at ThomHartmann.com, and this is about just a totally bizarre story about these three guys with no VA experience, not even veterans, who are all big shots down at Mar-a-Lago, that Donald Trump has put in charge of the Veterans Administration functionally. And their association, one of them is the head of Marvel Entertainment, their association with Johnson & Johnson and the New York Stock Exchange, and Johnson & Johnson, the big drug company, taking this very, very cheap chemical, ketamine, tweaking the molecule a little bit and rolling it out as a new anti-suicide drug, Spravato, that in clinical trials caused 6 people to die, 3 of them by suicide, and none of the people taking the placebo to die. And now Trump is telling the VA, you have to buy this highly inflated price drug from Johnson & Johnson, and the Democrats want to know what's up with the VA crowd guys. Check it out. It's at ThomHartmann.com. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Marlene in Toledo. Hey, Marlene, what's on your mind?
Good afternoon, Tom, and I appreciate your show. I just had to let you know my mother passed away in 2018, and I did her final tax return last year. She ended up getting a stimulus check. And yesterday, I got a letter from the White House, and it clearly says my mom's name, deceased, in care of me. Well, telling her that, here's your check, and I haven't gotten mine yet. And of course, it's signed by Donald Trump.
I would not deposit that check.
In fact, I called an accountant, and he said that they realize that there's this, there's a glitch in the system, and they will retrieve it. So, but I just want anybody else out there, if that has happened to them, the hypocrisy.
Yeah, and you got that obscene letter. These checks. What is it? The middle of April here? Or it's the end of April. It's going to be May tomorrow, and these things were supposed to go out at the beginning of the month, and it's just $1,200. I mean, it's nothing. I got Louise and I got ours on the 15th of April. I thought it was a Social Security deposit. I looked at it and thought, well, I haven't gotten my, and then I realized, that's $2,400 round number. So that's, me and Louise, $1,200 each. But it's for people who have paper checks, Trump had to hold it up so he could put his signature on it. And that arguably is a violation of the Hatch Act. The Hatch Act says that you may not use federal facilities to campaign, and, for partisan purposes. And this, in my opinion, is Trump's this is part of his presidential campaign. And I think it's illegal. And I think, there should be hell to pay for it. Yeah, thanks a lot for the call, Marlene. Spot on. Deborah in Grand Rapids. Hey, Deborah, Michigan. Deborah, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I really enjoyed Professor Wolff's spot. He's a great guest.
Fascinating stuff, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I live in Justin Amash territory, and sometimes I agree with him, sometimes I don't. But, he's thrown his hat in the ring, and I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Well, first of all, if I had him on this program, my first question would be, please name anybody in the history of the United States who's been elected on a third-party ticket, to the White House. It literally has never happened and probably never will happen. It certainly is not going to happen with Justin Amash, which leads you to assume that there's some other reason that he's running than wanting to be president. And I think that probably what he's doing, since he's going to lose his seat, I think that what he's doing is he's going to start basically being Ron Paul. He's going to start a little business of continuously running for president, as a fringe candidate, and a certain number of people will support him financially, and it'll be a nice little home business that he'll be able to keep going for a couple of years, maybe even a couple of decades. That's my opinion.
Okay.
But what do you think, Deborah? And what do the people in Grand Rapids think?
Oh, yeah. He lost a lot of support when he approved of the impeachment. Right. But, I still think, we're pretty pro-Amash in this area, not me in particular, and we're also having a great foray in Lansing today against our governor, and they're hollering and chanting. I call it the white people's vector myself. And they're all hollering, lock her up. So, that's
somebody had a billboard yesterday or a poster that they brought to one of those anti-Gretchen Whitmer rallies that said, get a rope. I mean, it's like this. These people are friggin' nuts. Is Amash running for re-election, or has he pulled out of the race? Or did he lose the primary?
I really don't know, but I know he's trying to get on the to run for president. I know that, but
right, on the
I think he's also running for re-election too here. I don't think he'll make it.
I'll have to check that out. I just don't know. Deborah, thank you. Thank you for the call. It's great to hear from you. Damon in Las Vegas. Hey, Damon, what's up?
Can you hear me, sir?
I can.
Okay, yeah. So here's the thing. I am a far left Democrat, okay? And I mean far left. I mean, Bernie is not as left as me. Let's put it like that. And I just want to speak about my little world. I live in Las Vegas, and I believe about 75% of the population aren't social distancing. Everybody I know is far left Democrats. We're tired of the Democrats. People are starving out here. People are losing their jobs, losing their homes, etc. If you want to stay
that doesn't mean you have to lose your life, Damon.
I understand. Can I finish? If you want to stay in the house, stay in the house. You want to order everything on Amazon. Your right to live does not trump my life, my choice to want.
Damon, nobody's telling you can't go out of the house.
I'm not wearing a mask.
What they're telling you is you can't get more than 6 feet from the person you're standing in line with at the store.
Well, they don't do that.
I don't see why that's such a huge sacrifice.
It is.
Are you that fragile, Damon?
That's right.
You are that fragile.
Why am I that fragile? Because I don't want to wear a mask. I never said nothing about the 6 feet. I said wearing a mask.
Yeah. I think what that says is that you're a very selfish person, Damon, and you don't give a rat's ass about other people's lives. And frankly, I think that's tragic. We'll be back. Oh, man. Let's see. We've got, in our next hour, we're going to be talking about the future of weather and flooding. Yeah, there's stuff going on there that doesn't have to do with COVID. And we're going to talk about that, and then we'll be back with the news of the day, and I'll be picking up your phone calls. So stick around. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
So every 5 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture comes out with new guidelines, and we just put up a video over at thomhartmann.com for supporters of our program that talks about how the Trump administration, in this insanely corrupt deal with the $100 billion industry of ultra-processed, high-sugar, high-salt, high-fat foods that is literally killing 700,000 Americans a year, has said, oh, we're going to change the guidelines so that these fast food, high-processed food companies can shovel their stuff into our school lunch programs, into our kids. We're going to change the guidelines so people aren't informed about the importance of, dialing back somewhat on meat and on salt and sugar and all these other things. It's nuts. You can check the whole thing out over at thomhartmann.com. Look for the video for our, the supporters of our program at thomhartmann.com. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Measuring What Counts, the Global Movement for Well-Being by Joe Stiglitz, Jean-Paul Fitoussi, and Martine Duran. And this is from the first chapter labeled Overview. The high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress, also known as HLEG, builds on the analyses and recommendations of the 2009 Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, also known as the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission, in highlighting the role of well-being metrics in policy and encouraging a more active dialogue among economic theory and statistical practice. The report makes explicit the often implicit assumptions hidden in statistical practices and their real-world consequences. Its central message is that what we measure affects what we do. If we measure the wrong thing, we will do the wrong thing. If we don't measure something, it becomes neglected, as if the problem didn't exist. There is no simple way of representing every aspect of well-being in a single number in the way GDP describes market economic output. This has led to GDP being used as a proxy for both economic welfare, like people's command over commodities, and general welfare, which also depends on people's attributes and non-market activities. GDP was not designed for this task. We need to move beyond GDP when assessing a country's health and complement GDP with a broader dashboard of indicators that would reflect the distribution of well-being in society and its sustainability across the social, economic, and environmental dimensions. Excuse me. The challenge is to make the dashboard small enough to be easily comprehensible, but large enough to summarize what we care about the most. The 2008 crisis and its aftermath illustrate why a change in perspective is needed. The GDP loss that followed the crisis was not the temporary one-off event predicted by conventional macroeconomic models. Its effects have lasted over time, suggesting that the crisis caused the permanent loss of significant amounts of capital, not just machines and structures, but also hidden capital in the form of lower on-the-job training, permanent scars on young people entering the labor market during a recession, and lower trust in an economic system rigged to benefit a few. Different metrics, including better measurements of people's economic insecurity, could have shown that the consequences of the recession were much deeper than the GDP statistics indicated, and governments might have responded more strongly to mitigate the negative impacts of the crisis. If, on the basis of GDP, the economy is perceived to be well on the road to recovery, as many governments believed in 2010, one would not take the strong policy measures needed to support people's living conditions suggested by metrics that inform on whether most of the population still feels in recession. Nor would one take measures to bolster the safety net and social protection in the absence of metrics on the extent of people's economic insecurity. These failings in the policy responses to the crisis were compounded by overly focusing on the consequences of public spending and raising government's liabilities, when this spending could take the form of investment, increasing the assets in governments and countries' balance sheets. The same follows when measures of unemployment do not reflect the full extent of a country's unused labor resources. The beyond GDP agenda is sometimes characterized as anti-growth, but this is not the case. The use of a dashboard of indicators reflecting what we value as a society would have led, most likely, to stronger GDP growth than that actually achieved by most countries after 2008.
This book also looks at progress in implementing the recommendations of the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission since 2009, identifying areas that require increased focus by statistical agencies, researchers, and policymakers. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, agreed by the international community in 2015, clearly go far beyond GDP. But their 169 policy targets and more than 200 indicators for global monitoring are too many to guide policies. Countries will have to identify their priorities within the broader UN agenda and upgrade their statistical capacities, which, even in developed countries, are insufficient to monitor whether the agreed-upon commitments are being met. The international community should invest in upgrading the statistical capacity of developing countries, especially in areas where country data are needed to assess global phenomena, such as climate change or the world distribution of income. Inequality in income and wealth has today a central role in policy discussions in ways it did not in 2009. But important progress is still needed in a range of areas, such as measuring what happens at both ends of the income distribution, integrating different data sources, and measuring the joint distribution of income, consumption, and wealth at the individual level. When looking at inequality, it's also important to look at differences between groups. These are called horizontal inequalities, at inequalities within households, and the way resources are shared and managed, which are especially important in the case of wealth. We should also look beyond inequality in outcomes to inequality of opportunity. Inequality of opportunity is even more unacceptable than inequality of outcomes. But the operational distinction between the two is fuzzy, as we don't observe all circumstances that shape people's outcomes and are independent of their efforts. The book Measuring What Counts by Joe Stiglitz and Friends. Democracy, that we have yet to learn the dangers of it from democracy. Despotism had to be opposed, whether it came from kings, lords, or the people. Laniganier's Tyranny of the Majority.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
On the line with us now is Dr. J. Famiglietti. He is the Executive Director of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan. His website, jayfamiglietti.com, and J. Famiglietti is also his Twitter handle. Dr. Famiglietti, welcome back to the program. It's been a while since we've talked, and thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, Tom.
So you've been writing about and researching the impact of global warming on flooding around the world. One dimension of water security, or in this case, arguably insecurity caused by water, and something that 20 years ago was not so much of an issue. Now we're seeing not just flooding caused by sea level rise, threatening our coastal towns, but also we saw last year across the American Midwest and across large parts of Europe and Russia and presumably other places. Those are the ones that I was keeping track of. Thunderstorms that are not moving through as rapidly as they used to because of the collapse of the polar vortex. What would have been a one-day rain turning into a 5-day rain that becomes a massive flooding event and wipes out towns and floods rivers and things. Where are we at with all of this, all of this flooding and the various types of flooding around the world as we move forward, as we add another point or two to the parts per million to the continuously upticking levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere?
Well, we're more or less at a tipping point, Tom, because none of that's getting any better, and factor in that we have population growth and continued development along river floodplains and along coastal areas. So the problem is only getting worse, and it's time for us to raise awareness, and it's time for the insurance industry to catch up and for the policymakers to catch up as well.
So specifically how? What should we be doing?
Well, so first of all, some of the numbers that are out there. I mean, flood damage, because of the population growth and the continued development, flood damage is expected to, it's almost like a quadrupling over the next couple of decades. We've had about $1 trillion of flood damage between 1980 and 2020, and we're looking at getting close to $1 trillion by the end of this decade. So raising awareness is really, really important, and that's awareness among people, and that's awareness amongst policymakers, zoning boards, etc. But we have to also be thinking about things like managed migration, and that's starting to happen. It's happening in different places around the United States, both coastal areas and along river floodplains. We have to be thinking about incentives to make that happen, and we probably need to be thinking about taxes. We really need to be thinking about making it very expensive, if not impossible, to keep building along these really, really vulnerable locations.
Yeah. Are you? I realize you're Canadian, but are you seeing any evidence of a political will to do anything about this, either in your country or mine?
Yeah. So actually, I'm American, Tom. I only moved out here a couple of years ago. So yeah, I've spent most of my career in California. But that gives me that sort of the bilateral view, and I think that in Canada. There's much more awareness. It's first of all, it's more of a resource-driven country, so water and energy and food are really, really important. But there's not the partisanship that there is in the United States. So there's more interest in dealing with these issues and in working with researchers and in using science than in the United States. In the U.S., there's still some resistance, but Tom, what's going to put it over the edge is some of those dollar figures that I mentioned. Once you start talking about hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars and trillions of dollars, right? That's what captures people's attention.
Are we seeing a phenomena of the poor get hammered and the rich don't care, and therefore nothing happens until the rich start getting hammered? I mean, we have poor folks tend to be the ones living in floodplains. The 9th District or Ward of New Orleans comes to mind. Got wiped out during Hurricane Katrina because basically it was cheap land. That's where poor people built their houses, or where they built houses designed to house poor people. But now it's reaching the point where it's going over that threshold, and it's not just wiping out poor people anymore. Now it's starting to take out multi-million-dollar mansions on fancy shore coast properties and things. Is that what it's going to take? I mean, is that what's going on, or am I just being way too cynical here?
Well, there's a little cynicism going on there. It's a healthy dose of cynicism, and that is in part what's going on. And when I lived in California, I lived in Irvine. It's very close to Newport Beach, and I swear I just expected. I think that the population that lived along the coast there expected California to build a monstrous seawall to protect their homes. So there is some of that. Unfortunately, that's how things work in the United States and other governments that are operating in a similar fashion these days. That it takes that the wealthier people need to experience that catastrophe firsthand before they are willing to have conversations with the politicians with whom they support.
We're talking with Dr. Jay Famiglietti, Executive Director of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan. We're talking largely about effect here, the consequence of climate change, which is causing ice to melt and sea level to rise and more severe storms and things like that. What's the state of affairs with regard to the cause, that is climate change itself? Do you think that there's a general awakening around that, and are you seeing evidence of political will in Canada or the United States to do something about climate change?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think awakening is probably the right phrase for the United States. But in Canada, again, I think there's more there's more awareness. But, I think oftentimes we forget that really water is like the vector which is delivering the consequences of climate change. Yes, temperature is increasing for sure, but what are we always talking about, right? We're talking about more severe floods, more intense droughts, even sea level rise is driven by melting water, driven by the melting ice sheets and melting glaciers. I think we have passed a point in North America, in particular in the United States, where it's impossible to ignore. I mean, things are happening so rapidly now. That won't surprise me at all when we get past the COVID-19 epidemic that we actually start seeing some bipartisan action on climate change, in particular after taking a look at how we've got these, or have had for a while now, since we've all been working from home, these beautiful clear skies and cleaner waters.
Yeah, it really is amazing, and it seems to me that the Green New Deal is just perfectly positioned for this. We need a New Deal. We need to put Americans back to work. We need our infrastructure to be rebuilt, but we need to do it in a way that's not carbon intensive. And I'm just very, very hopeful that that's going to come along. Dr. Jay Famiglietti, I really appreciate you dropping by, sir. The Executive Director of the Global Institute for Water Security at the University of Saskatchewan, jfamiglietti.com, the website and the Twitter handle. Jay, thanks so much for dropping by. Great talking to you.
Thanks again, Tom.
Yeah, have a great afternoon and keep up the great work. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls after this. It's 15 minutes past the hour on the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Stick around. We'll be right back. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, helping you win the water cooler wars, your media support group for We the People. And welcome back. Let's see here. Jerry in Tomah, Wisconsin. Hey, Jerry, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Good afternoon. I've got a couple of things that are just bothering me to no end. This deal with Mike Pence not wearing his mask. Well, we know he's an idiot, but what about the people?
Well, his wife has come out and said in his defense that he didn't know he was supposed to wear a mask. That's sort of like showing up at a cocktail party wearing ratty old blue jean shorts and a tank top and looking around and saying, "Well, gee, it didn't occur to me I should dress up for a cocktail party." I mean, maybe that's an elitist analogy, or showing up at work without your pants on. I mean, it's like this is so crazy.
But his people were told ahead of time, and why didn't Mayo stick to their guns? Mayo should have stuck to their guns and said, "I'm sorry."
Oh, they shouldn't have deleted their tweet. I
don't even know what he's visiting there for anyway. Yeah.
Well, for a photo op. And he got it. And he sure got it.
And speaking of photo ops, the other thing that's bugging me is Trump with these 1,000 cadets at West Point that have to go back to, fly in an airplane and go back to New York, which is, it's crazy. I mean, he wants them to go back just for his BS speech,
Right. He's craving a crowd, and so he's going to order the military to give him one, just like he wanted his military parade last November for Veterans Day or Memorial Day.
And Pence at least had them separated with the Air Force, but according to the article I read, Trump wants them nice and tight. In other words, marching. It's just it just blows my mind.
I know.
Well, I just wanted to vent, I guess.
Well, you did a fine job of it, Jerry, and I share your concerns, and I salute your venting. Thank you for the call. April in Santa Monica. Hey, April, what's up? Thanks for watching Free Speech TV.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure. I'm actually just kind of concerned that we spend so much time pointing our fingers at Donald Trump, who is awful and who's going to probably remain awful, when we're supposed to be a nation of laws. And if indeed he has broken laws, which Nancy Pelosi has stood on the floor and said that he has done, why is it that we as a country are unable to do anything about it? Why is it that we cannot stop him? Why is it that this one man is allowed to do whatever he does, and we just all freak out and throw our hands up in the air like, oh my God, what is he going to do next? We obviously are not the nation of laws that we thought that we were, and I think that we need to concentrate on doing something about that. And the Democratic Party is the party that. Go ahead.
No, you ask why is it? Let me give you a list. It is Martha McSally in Arizona who voted not to impeach Trump. It's Cory Gardner in Colorado who voted not to impeach Trump. It's Kelly Loeffler in Georgia, David Perdue of Georgia, Joni Ernst of Iowa, Susan Collins of Maine, Steve Daines of Montana, Tom Tillis of North Carolina, John Cornyn of Texas, and Lindsey Graham of South Carolina.
I do understand that a lot of people did not vote to impeach Trump. My other question about that is why would we have a Trump impeachment that was such a narrow scope? If we had any other man in the presidency who had 40 women who accused him of sexual assault, who had casinos, not casinos, but hotels all over that he was trying to use, there were so many other grounds for impeachment, and we just usually you want to throw the book at someone like that. We did this little narrow scope, and it allowed.
I'm with you, April, but had it been broader, it would have gone down in flames even more rapidly. April, thank you for the call.
Our 1 hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3 hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. So over at thomhartmann.com, we just put up a new video for our supporters, the people who support our program, that talks about Malcolm X saying, if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are oppressed and loving the people who are the oppressors. He said that 55 years ago to this month, February, in 1965. And what that actually means, how that warning from Malcolm X was apparently taken to heart by the Republican Party in 1981 through the Reagan presidency. And we actually saw this shift in America to the point where, that led to everything. Stop and frisk and the demonization of homeless people and the demonization of poor people and black people and Muslim people and all of this stuff came out of this very specific kind of Lee Atwater strategy in the 1980s. So you can find it over at thomhartmann.com and check it out.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. The New York Times reporting that the total death tolls, this is a verbatim quote from a piece by Katz, Liu, and Katz. Total deaths in 7 states that have been hit hard by the coronavirus pandemic are nearly 50% higher than normal for the 5 weeks from March 8 through April 11, according to new death statistics from the CDC. That's 9,000 more deaths than were reported as of April 11th as official coronavirus deaths. They go on to say, if you look at the provisional deaths from all causes, death counts in New York, New Jersey, Michigan, Massachusetts, Illinois, Maryland, and Colorado have sparked far above their normal levels for the period. In New York, the home of the biggest outbreak, the number of deaths over this period is more than 3 times the normal number. We're talking about deaths that are not considered coronavirus deaths. In New Jersey, deaths have been 172% of the normal number. More than 5,000 additional deaths, again, not counting coronavirus. In Michigan, it's the equivalent of about 2,000 deaths, 121% higher. So, people are stroking out from coronavirus. Young people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. There's a big story in the Washington Post earlier this week or over the weekend about that specifically. The clotting of this thing seems just nuts. And older people, 40, 50, 60, are having heart attacks. This stuff inflames the insides of arteries and veins and thus causes strokes and causes heart attacks. And they're not being identified as coronavirus deaths. Massachusetts is actually looking into this. Charlie Baker, the state's governor, has asked that this be, they've got 60,000 cases of coronavirus, 3,400 deaths. That's massive in Massachusetts, but they're looking at all these deaths and Charlie Baker is saying people have gone back and started to do some work to try and figure out if there are cases where people presented with what could have been deemed as COVID-19 symptoms and possibly were categorized in some other way. And yes, according to the New York Times today, that's happening. Meanwhile, Florida, this is, I haven't confirmed this, I've seen it reported in 2 different places, it was on CNN, that Florida, number one, the governor has told the coroners around the state not to list COVID as a cause of death, just to say they're dead, number one, homicide or disease. And number two, that apparently if you die in Florida and you're not a permanent resident of Florida, you're not essentially a citizen of Florida, but you're a snowbird, you go down there for 3 months in the winter, or you're you were there on spring break, or you're there vacationing or visiting family and you die of coronavirus, Florida apparently doesn't count you as a Florida death. DeSantis is doing everything he can to try and keep his death statistics down because he knows he's got a tsunami coming. Meanwhile, I'm on the mailing list for Veritas, which is this Project Veritas is this organization that is run by some real whack jobs. They're the ones who, James O'Keefe and his buddies, they're the ones who go out and, they took down Acorn by selectively editing video to make it look like Acorn was, pimping people out and stuff. I mean, it's just obscene. So anyhow, I just got an email from them. Today, Project Veritas is sharing with you the latest tip we followed up on by releasing conversations with funeral home directors and their staff throughout New York City, questioning the number of deaths officially attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then he lists some of the key findings from the video, and they're just bullet points. Judge calls BS on relative's COVID-19 cause of death. Funeral home. To me, all you're doing is padding the statistics, making the death rates in New York City higher than estimated. Staten Island funeral director questions Mayor de Blasio's role and adds, I think it's political. Brooklyn funeral director, they're padding the numbers. Medical examiner's too busy to investigate. Brooklyn funeral director, 40-year-old died at home with no symptoms other than fever, was toe tagged as COVID-19. In other words, what the right wing is saying right now, what James O'Keefe and his buddies are saying, is that there aren't as many dead people as you think. Those official numbers for COVID deaths are wrong because they're just making this stuff up to make Trump look bad. Well, how does that account for the fact that the overall death rate from all causes is massively up in New York and these other states where you have these large outbreaks, and yet you don't have deaths from car accidents? I mean, nobody's driving. You don't have deaths from many workplace deaths. It's a major source of injury and death. Those aren't happening. I mean, it's like they're literally trying to say the sky is not blue anymore, it's green. And the grass is not green anymore, it's blue. And what you've been seeing is backwards. And this is going to help out Trump somehow? To have James O'Keefe out there saying, they're lying about how many people are dying from COVID. At the same time that all the experts and the main media and actual scientists and the Centers for Disease Control itself, these are CDC statistics. The CDC that has repaired their website not to show the early cases of COVID in the United States. I mean, it's bizarre what the CDC has done on their website. When you try to look at previous data. But that CDC is saying, you've got more deaths that probably should be attributable to COVID, and we can't find another explanation for it. And the states are going back and looking at this. I mean, how did Americans dying become partisan? How'd that happen? Oh, yeah, that's right. That Republican president was completely incompetent and didn't pay any attention to the scientists and the warnings from the CIA and the Pentagon and everybody else back in November that this thing was coming. That's how it became partisan. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Trump is starting to get frantic that he's not going to get reelected. And, let's blame China. Let's blame Obama. Let's say that they're lying about the numbers.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Today we're reading from Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Unwanted Spy by Jeffrey Sterling, The Persecution of an American Whistleblower. This is from the prologue. Where am I? How did I get here? Those are the kinds of thoughts you have when your ultimate nightmare comes true. It was January 26th, 2015, my second long day of waiting in a small, windowless, soundless conference room just outside the courtroom number 5 on the 4th floor of the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia. Over the past 2 weeks, I had been on trial, accused of violating the century-old Espionage Act. As an undercover officer for the Central Intelligence Agency, I'd been involved in Operation Merlin, a covert scheme to derail the Iranian effort to build a nuclear bomb by providing their scientists with fake, flawed blueprints for warheads channeled through a Russian scientist. Operation Merlin had ultimately backfired when the Iranian experts detected the fraud, as revealed in the book State of War by reporter James Risen. Agency leaders were furious, not at themselves for launching a risky and ill-conceived scheme, but at the author who dared to expose their incompetence. In their eagerness to punish someone for their embarrassment, they looked around for a scapegoat. They found me. A compliant U.S. attorney dutifully filed an indictment charging me with, quote, unlawful retention and unauthorized disclosure of national defense information, mail fraud, unauthorized conveyance of government property, and obstruction of justice, end quote. 9 criminal charges in all, based on the claim that I'd supposedly leaked classified information about Operation Merlin to James Risen. The truth is that I did not leak any classified information related to CIA operations to James Risen or to anyone else. But I am a whistleblower. I'd blown the whistle by suing the CIA for discriminating against me when I was an employee there. I'd also attempted to blow the whistle about the dangers of Operation Merlin, not by leaking, but by submitting my warnings to staff members of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Sadly, those warnings were ignored. I'd been forced to accept some disheartening truths, that neither blatant discrimination nor a dangerous operation related to weapons of mass destruction were matters of real concern to the powers that be at the agency or among the members of Congress charged with oversight of intelligence matters. Even before the trial had begun, I'd known that my prospects weren't good. The world had witnessed the cases of Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, John Kiriakou, and a series of other whistleblowers whose prosecution, some said persecution, had been pursued by President Barack Obama with an eagerness that almost suggested a personal vendetta. In the atmosphere created by these cases, the mere accusation of having leaked classified information was enough to automatically condemn someone. In refusing to plead guilty and instead insisting on my right to go to trial, I knew I was facing an uphill battle, but I could not and would not confess to something I did not do. During the trial, the government did not present a shred of hard evidence to validate the charges against me. Even Judge Leonie Brinkman summarized the case against me as being based on, quote, very powerful circumstantial evidence, end quote, rather than on hard proof. But there was one incriminating fact about which there could be no doubt. The CIA had paraded a whole host of current and former agents in front of the jury, and I didn't look like any of them. I was a black man who dared to build a career serving my country as an officer of the CIA. The trial had lasted a week and a half. Now I was enduring the most excruciating part of the whole ordeal, waiting for a verdict. How the hell did it all come to this? I'd grown up as a true believer in the American dream. Work hard, do your duty, stand up for yourself. Those were the rules of the game, or so I'd been taught. I knew I'd done nothing wrong, and I knew that fighting against wrongs is what an American hero is supposed to do. That's all I knew how to do. That's why I was now clinging to hope and continuing to fight, unable to comprehend how defending my rights could somehow get me branded a traitor. Thankfully, I wasn't alone in that waiting room. My wife, Holly, and my attorneys, Ed McMahon and Barry J. Pollock, were there beside me. But having company isn't very comforting when you have no words to say to one another. Silence can be uncomfortable, and when it's forced, it can be absolutely nerve-wracking. All of them, especially Holly, had believed in me and fought for me, and I could tell that awaiting the jury's decision was almost as excruciating for them as it was for me. But for me, there was a sharper twist to this agonizing time of uncertainty. More than waiting to learn my fate, I was waiting to learn what my country thought of me. This was a question I'd wrestled with my entire life. The experience was often stressful, even painful. My entire life had been one of fighting against stereotypes, assumptions, and limitations placed on me because of the color of my skin, something that happened to me repeatedly in both white America and black America. The American dream I believed in and strove for wasn't a white American dream or a black American dream. It was simply my American dream, But to many of those around me, it must not have been the right American dream, because I kept getting into trouble through no intention of my own. That, in a nutshell, is the story of the events that brought me to this room. My years of struggling to find a place in American society where I could be accepted for who I am. My battle to be recognized as a worthy member of the CIA. My shadowy conflict with people within the agency who for some reason were unwilling to accept me as part of their team. Unwanted Spy by Jeffrey Sterling.
Coming up on the Science Revolution, as the Georgia governor rolled out a new death panel coronavirus plan, Dr. Andrew Glickson is here on the coronavirus versus climate extinction. While we're dealing with COVID-19, we're also hurtling toward extinction. Dr. Justin Frank drops by saying Trump could see dead bodies from coronavirus and just step over them. What? Also, Greg Palast explains the secret history of the Deepwater Horizon, BP's second blowout. It's the 10-year anniversary for Deepwater Horizon's debacle. Find the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. Welcome back. Well, tempers are fraying. Louise went out to pick up some gardening stuff yesterday. And yes, was very, very careful. We got a great store here that delivers it out to the car, and you give them the credit card in advance, and it's no contact and all that kind of stuff. But several drivers are just like maniacs. And, I think people are starting to express their fear or their rage in other ways. They're around losing their jobs or the prospect of losing their jobs or not being able to pay their bills or whatever it may be. And it's turning into road rage. There's a story, there was a mail carrier who was shot because the guy was upset that he hadn't gotten a stimulus check. I mean, it's getting weird. And in Michigan right now, and this is where it's really getting weird, well, let me back up a little bit, actually. I'm on the mailing list for FreedomWorks. And, you can get on it, too. It's fascinating. I think it's freedomworks.com. It might be .org. But in any case, FreedomWorks is the group that, the Koch brothers helped create back in the day and that led the charge against Obamacare. We don't want no stinking government messing with our Medicare, right? And no to Obamacare. People shouldn't have health insurance or health care. Choice. We want choice. The choice to die in the gutter. That was FreedomWorks, and it's basically a billionaire-funded shill, front organization. They got Stephen Moore working for them now, and they've been sending out these emails. I've read a few of them on the air. I read one earlier in the week or late last week to share with you, basically saying that they're setting up these protests, and they listed 8 or 9 states where they were setting up protests, or they were encouraging protests, or they were simply informing their readers of protests to try to open the economy up. Now, why do the billionaires want to open the economy up? Because they're safe in their mansions. They want the little people to go to work, right? The guy who runs Smithfield Foods and is paid millions of dollars a year as a CEO, he's not showing up at the meat packing plant. The governors of these states are not showing up at the meat packing plants. The billionaires who it's not happening. But the billionaires want the working people to show up because, hey, we got to get our money. Keep in mind, nobody makes money if somebody doesn't do something. Working people create all this wealth, these billions and trillions of dollars in wealth. So now in Michigan, event organizer Jason Howland told WOOD-TV, this is a big TV station in Grand Rapids, he said the goal from Thursday, that's today, I'll tell you in just a second about what they're doing. He says the goal was to get a no vote on the extension of the emergency declaration from the state Senate. And we want our rights back, right? So here's what happened. All these protesters just hours or minutes ago showed up at the Michigan State House in Lansing with guns, forced their way into the Capitol building, forced their way into the floor of the House of Representatives and started chanting things like, first it was let us in, let us in, let us in. Heil Whitmer, Governor Whitmer, the Democratic governor. It's just nuts. And there's a great summary of this over at Raw Story that Travis Getty's put together. These guys are the shills for the billionaires, and I'll bet they don't even realize it. Just like the Tea Partiers didn't realize. What a nice bus we've got here with Tea Party on the side of it to carry us to the protest. Never wondering, where did the money come from to rent this bus? It's the billionaires. So, the billionaires have their suckers in Michigan and around the country. And, it takes a fairly low IQ, I guess, to be a sucker for these billionaires, which is why you get these dead enders. You get these people who are showing up with, Confederate flags and Nazi memorabilia and guns and stuff like that. And it's really kind of sad. Meanwhile, over at the White House, Joe Grogan, who is the top domestic policy advisor for Donald Trump, has announced he's leaving. Before he came to the Trump White House, by the way, he was the top lobbyist for Gilead Pharmaceutical. And thus, at the White House, he was playing a principal role in making sure that drug pricing stuff didn't diminish the profits of the big drug companies. You're hearing remdesivir, I believe is how it's pronounced, might shorten the course of a COVID infection by 30%. We don't know yet what the price is going to be. This is a drug, by the way, that was developed in collaboration with the U.S. government, with the money from the National Institutes of Health. But are we going to get any benefits from it? No, the company's going to make a fortune. And that would be Gilead, the company that Grogan used to work for as a lobbyist. And in Maryland, Republican Governor Larry Hogan is saying that he's having the Maryland National Guard and the state police guarding his stockpile of COVID test kits that he was successful in buying from South Korea. His wife is Korean, she speaks Korean, and she cut a deal with a South Korean company to get these test kits. He had to bring the plane into the BWI airport, the Baltimore airport, instead of Dulles, so that the federal government wouldn't seize them. And now he's trying to keep Kushner's goons away, because Kushner is running around the country seizing masks, seizing testing kits, seizing all kinds of stuff, particularly from blue states. But Larry Hogan is a Republican. It's mind-boggling what's going on. So anyhow, I just wanted to update you on what's happening right now. Joe in Swainsboro, Georgia. Hey, Joe, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. How you doing?
I'm
Tom,
fine. What's up?
I'm a former college professor. I taught health education, backpacking survival, became a certified EMT in the state of New Jersey. I have some idea of a lot of the things that you're mentioning. And also, I classify you as an All-American. Since I coached, I'll give you my vote for All-American. And my grandpa...
That's very kind of you.
Oh, you're welcome, for sure. You deserve it, believe me. My grandpa, who lived in the state of New Jersey with my grandma back in 1918, my dad was 7 and his brother was 8 at the time. And he died from the Spanish flu. And
oh my.
I never had that opportunity to see him, but again, my grandma and my 2 uncles, or my father and his brother, they had a chance to live through that. And I'm 76 years old, and I've been here since 1943, and I think I've lived through a few things in my time. So I'm just trying to share that with you and your listeners. And there's a certain level of deliberate indifference and deliberate avoidance, not only by Trump, but Congress, the IRS, and a variety of other agencies that we have to deal with, 56 in all, from what I believe. And partly it's the problem and the result of the indifference of the populace, the voters, and any combination thereof. And someone like yourself...
I am guessing, Joe... I'm guessing that your family was impacted by the death of your grandfather. I look at my mother, whose father died when she was 13 of a heart attack, in the late 30s as a result of the Great Depression. He got wiped out, He lost everything, and had a heart attack, and died. And she never recovered from that. I mean, she used to listen to Neil Diamond albums because his voice sounded just like her father. And I never met him. I didn't know who he was, but she would just listen to these songs on and on and on because it sounded like Daddy. And she was so wounded by that. And just think of, we've got 60,000 families in the United States, probably 100,000, who are mourning and grieving right now because Donald Trump didn't stop this virus at our shores the way that Australia did, the way that New Zealand did, the way that South Korea did, the way that Japan did, the way that Germany is, because we have just an incompetent idiot in the White House. I'm assuming it affected your family too, Joe?
Oh, big time. My dad often spoke of his dad, and all I could see is pictures. And it's unfortunate. Of the 60,000 that we're dealing with now that have experienced death, and as you mentioned today, probably 20 or 30,000 more. And one of the things that I think about is, as a former professional, professor, and a health educator, knowing how easily diseases are passed around in the world. And I've been to all 50 states. I've been to all the provinces of Canada, Mexico. I traveled Western Europe. I worked in Saudi Arabia. I understand third world. I've been to the Philippines. I've been to Japan. I know what third world is, and I know how poor it is. I grew up poor. And currently I have prostate cancer. I have lung issues. I had open heart surgery, and I'm still here, thankfully. And I only wish more people would really and truly do things that you suggest and that you mention and you talk about, and deal with their representatives in a way that would have to get something changed.
Yeah, we do have to, I really think that at the end of all this, a couple of years down the road, we're going to look back and say this was a major turning point. This was when America decided not to embrace fascism, and the fascism that Donald Trump was leading us towards, that America decided to reject oligarchy and Reaganism and trickle-down economics and the whole thing, the initial government response, the Trump administration response to the Trump Depression, the Great Depression of 2020, was so incompetent that we got to bring new people in. Joe, thanks so much for the call. It's great to hear from you and to swap stories with you. Thank you, and thanks for your kind words. We'll be back in just a minute with more of your calls. It's 15 minutes before the hour. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with more of your calls and the news of the day in just a moment. And welcome back. Harlan in Minneapolis. Hey, Harlan, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on the unique institutional role of the U.S. Postal Service, based on my experience with the initiative by the USPS that was eventually stifled by the powers that be, similar to what you've talked about, with electric vehicles and in the postal fleet. And I'm a retired software engineer in the early 1990s, during the early years of the Internet, before the web had emerged. I worked on a project for the post office to develop a system of electronic commerce services. This included document authentication and identity verification for government and private organizations. With
basically
the
to move the post office into the Internet age, right?
Yeah, right. And they were just getting started on that, and they were, wanted to get involved in the new electronic era and that. And so, and they were going to provide, these services for private organizations and for the government too, with the USPS acting as a central certificate authority for managing public key certificates and digital signatures. And the post office was in a special position as an independent quasi-government agency to manage the electronic transactions, not just for government, but also between private companies as a trusted third party. In any case, we came up with a prototype and for these services, and only to have it shut down, I think, by members of Congress. And so I just wanted to get this out there, and just as the role that the post office could provide as a centralized development for the development of the Internet and cyberspace. And even now it's a role that they could be playing as a semi-autonomous government agency to act as a trusted intermediary for the digital world.
Yeah, we discussed this a lot on this show back in the early 2000s, in 2003, 4, 5. There was a lot of conversation about this sort of thing, and it was, and then of course, the Bush administration was, doing everything they could to hurt the post office. And in 2006 came, in 2005, the post office was talking about electric vehicles, and so in 2006 they hit them with a $5 billion a year fee. And it ran out in 2016, but it just kneecapped the post office. And I was even suggesting back at that time that really we should designate the internet as part of the commons, as an essential infrastructure part of the commons, and hand the regulation of it over not to the FCC but to the post office, and and let the post office be the provider, the default and least expensive provider of email, and and then they could offer email franchises to other companies, to companies and things like that. But none of that ever took off. There was not the political support for it. There was not the political will for it. For big government solutions, which is what that was perceived as. And now we've got, we've even killed off net neutrality, which is a real tragedy. So,
right.
When were you working on that, Harlan?
It was early 90s, about 1993, that time period. So
yeah, that was back when I was running forms on CompuServe.
Yeah, no, they were very early on involved and wanted to be part of the latest in the electronic era.
And they should have been, in my opinion. Harlan, thanks for the story. Thanks for sharing that with us. I appreciate it. It's great to hear from you. We will be back in just a moment. We're coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980 and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. 10 minutes before the hour, welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, your media support group for We the People. Archie in Remsur, North Carolina. Am I saying that right, Archie?
Yeah, you're real close. How are you, Tom?
So what's up? I'm fine. What's on your mind?
Well, I noticed you did, your last caller mentioned the internet, or you mentioned the internet being part of the commons. And I thought that really led in well to what I was thinking about.
Which is?
Well, I teach at a rural school, and I have about 118 students on my roster, and I make contact with them every day, and we play a couple of games like Quizlet Live, and I have very few students that have good enough internet service to participate. I usually have about 10 kids that are able to participate. And
out of 118?
Yeah.
Wow. And that's because of poor broadband infrastructure in rural areas in North Carolina?
Well, yeah, that's part of the problem. But we haven't connected too well with them as far as online learning due to that. And we do send homework packets that are supposed to be equal to the online learning possibilities that they can take part in.
So you mail that to them and they do the homework and they mail it back?
Well, we mail it to them and they're doing the work, and I email the kids every day about it, but I'm not sure if we're going to even be able to get the work back.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that, Archie. This is, we need a massive nationwide rebooting of the assumptions of our economy. This gets into the area where, is the economy here to serve us as people, or are we here to serve the fat cats who basically own and control the economy? And since 1980, the latter, the fat cats own the economy and we're here to serve them. That's been the prevailing thought through all these, we're 40 years into the experiment of Reaganism. And, we need to go back to Keynesianism, to FDRism. It's a very sad story to hear. Archie, thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you for calling in and watching us on Free Speech TV. Mike in Oakland, listening on 910 AM out of San Francisco. Hey, Mike, what's on your mind today?
Yes, sir. My heart goes out to all the victims and the family of who got this virus, first of all.
Yeah.
But according to The Guardian today, it looks like we got another whole war going on with the commies. Only this time it's not based on nukes, but biological warfare.
Yeah, Trump has ordered Mike Pompeo to talk to all the spy agencies and see if he can get some proof that this virus came out of a lab in Wuhan, China. The scientists who look at the DNA are all saying, the DNA would tell you if it came out of a lab, and it didn't. It came out of a bat. But Trump wants to be able to blame it on China. Today in the press conference, he tried to blame it on Obama. He said Obama left him broken test kits for a virus that didn't exist. Anyhow, Mike, I'm sorry I interrupted you. You want to finish your thought?
Well, also, Dr. Peter Bregan in the Science Journal, Nature, of November 2015, has fascinating input on the subject. And I'm just wondering, is this another WMD accusation going on?
That's essentially what Trump's trying to do. He's trying to play the victim card, and he's trying to say, all you guys who died and all you families who are mourning the loss of your people, it's not my fault because I failed to do anything about it in November when I was warned, in December when I was warned, in January when I was warned, in February when I was warned, and finally we did a little bit in March. He's saying it's not my fault, it's the fault of those nasty Chinese. Yeah, there you go. Mike, thanks for the call. Steve in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Hey, Steve, what's up?
Yeah, I was just following up on a conversation you had earlier when you were talking about putting the identity of a person as sort of an emblem of the COVID
if I can
virus.
just real quickly recap that. Back a year or so ago, Kate Steinle was an attractive middle-aged white woman who was killed by an undocumented person's gun falling on the ground and discharging into her. And Fox News and Trump and right-wing hate radio ran with that for months. And I'm saying we need a Kate Steinle. We need a victim of the COVID virus that average white Americans will identify with. Back to you, Steve.
Well, what made me think about that was maybe more of an identity for small cities. I live outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I believe our population is about 80,000 people. And a lot of people come here to visit, and it may be an identity factor if everybody thought everybody in the town of Santa Fe as being dead.
Yeah, but that's an abstraction. What I'm saying is that we need to find one person who died of this virus, who left behind a family, who has a story that would be a Norman Rockwell kind of middle class American story, and say this is the face of this virus. And, because you've got, basically right-wing hate radio and Fox News, they're starting now, their main message is, this is only killing black people, old people, and poor people, so don't worry, it's all good. And, in fact, that's not the case. Black people, poor people, and elderly people are sustaining the majority of the deaths, but certainly not exclusively. And, so I'm saying, we need to find the equivalent of Kate Steinle and start deify that person on the left. But, I don't think the left is so organized they can pull it off. Anyhow, thanks so much for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow. Anything Goes Friday, same time, same place. And in the meantime, don't forget democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us to participate. And there's a lot you can do online. There's a lot you can do from home. In particular, waking up your friends and neighbors and telling them where they can find good progressive media. Share the word. And thanks so much for being with us. Tag You're It. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon. Be safe.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
We have a new video up over at ThomHartmann.com for people who are regular supporters of our program, and the essence of it is